former CIA agent who blew the whistle on the CIA torture, and Sean from the Yale Security Lab. Is that the name? I'm sorry, Privacy Lab, rather.
Privacy Lab. We do cybersecurity too as well, Joe.
Yes, she's with me. And I'm going to just start off by just reading some headlines, basically, of what's happened in the last week. This is the second in this weekly series. We're going every Friday night now at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the U.S. until 11 p.m. And we're really happy that everybody who's with us right now, who's joining us for this important event, and I hope many more join you in the course of the next 3 hours. We had in the last week, we spoke last week a little bit about this article or story, but I don't even think it deserves that word, those descriptions by Luke Harding in The Guardian, in which he wrote that Paul Manafort visited Julian Assange 3 times in the embassy, in the Ecuador embassy in London. There's no evidence given whatsoever, and there would be copious evidence if that actually took place, video surveillance cameras, sign-ins, etc. It was backed by nothing. They have gone silent, The Guardian, in the last 2 weeks since that piece appeared. They've been attacked, even by mainstream media. There was a piece in the Washington Post saying this is a bombshell story that has not yet failed to explode. So they've just crawled into a hole here. I happened to be at an event at the National Press Club here in Washington last week, and the David Russberger was the former Guardian editor at the time of the WikiLeaks publications, and he was on stage being interviewed by Marty Barron, who's the top editor at the Washington Post. And afterward, I cornered Russberger, and I said to him, I asked him, what about this Harding story? I said, I know you're not the editor anymore. Of course, he said, I don't know anything about it. And that was that. I didn't expect anything from him on that. But that story is dead, except it has legs in, of all places, the United States Senate. And this week, just a couple of days ago, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California tweeted this: given the role of WikiLeaks in election interference efforts and reports of Paul Manafort visiting Julian Assange. I love this reports, by the way. There was one report that has failed to stand up, but she talks about reports, plural, of Paul Manafort visiting Julian Assange. We're calling on Secretary of State Pompeo to brief us, the Senate, on his recent meeting with Ecuadorian officials. The public deserves answers on foreign interference in our elections. And she's attached a letter that was sent to Pompeo, and was a series of questions about did you ask the foreign minister Valencia to confirm whether Manafort visited Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, including as recently as March 2016, as has been described in media reports? Did you request that the complete unedited log of Assange's visits at the Ecuador be made available? Or at least they're questioning here evidence. These are the things that the Guardian story should have, in fact, reported. But the thrust of the letter is how to get Assange out of the embassy. This is a very troubling development. We then had a press conference, apparently, that Assange had, what certain reporters, Telesur reports. I was unaware of this until I read this, that Telesur has reported, I'm looking for it here, that he told these reporters that he is being surveilled. Julian said he's being surveilled by Ecuadorian government, and it's being given directly to the FBI. That basically the FBI is running an operation to pressure Quito to get him out of the embassy, to end his asylum deal, extradite him to the U.S. And part of that is FBI surveillance through the Ecuadorian government. That would not be hard to believe that that's happening. Assange, in this interview, also criticized the Ecuadorian authorities, saying that officials at the embassy had made, quote, pejorative and threatening comments about him, and that his work as a journalist had been questioned. He says he described living in solitary confinement that's threatening his health. Of course, we all knew that, but Julian himself apparently has now said that. An interesting quote in this story I'm reading, quoting the El Comercio, a newspaper in Ecuador, a daily newspaper, quoted the new UK ambassador, the new Ecuadorian ambassador to Britain, Jaime Marchand, and the quote is, in the recent years, due to the situation over the embassy, there's been an obligatory cooling and distancing in the relationship with Britain, and now Ecuador is moving to improve relations with Britain. He says of Assange that the embassy is not an asylum camp, but a diplomatic mission and has a daily function to fulfill. Assange should be the one to make the decision to leave, however. Clearly, the Ecuadorian government does not want to have the give the authority or the clearance of the British police to go in and get him, which they can do. That would be politically just not the right optics. Obviously, they don't want to have to deal with that. They're trying to force him out by making his life even a greater hell than it has already been. Now, Julian also testified in the case, the appeal that they lost, the first case in the Ecuador court about trying to overthrow these new stringent conditions that were put on him several months ago, which he's lost contact with the outside world. He has no internet contact, which is why I find it curious that he gave this report, this press conference, basically, to a group of reporters. If anybody else knows about that, I'd be interested. Maybe Susie knows. So he spoke and testified, I believe, yesterday about that. We don't have a resolution yet of this appeal, but we're hoping, of course, that it's overturned and he can get back his internet access. There has not been a new hearing on the release of the inadvertently disclosed criminal complaint or indictment made by the United States government against Julian Assange. That we found out about a couple of weeks ago when the prosecutor mistakenly cut and paste something from Julian's complaint into someone else's indictment. Had nothing to do with Julian Assange. It was spotted. So this Reporters Committee for Freedom has has made an appeal, not a suit, but an appeal to the American government, the Justice Department, to release this. The government is saying they can't because he hasn't been arrested yet. He might flee, which is absolutely ridiculous because he does not want to flee. They want him to flee. So we haven't had an update on that yet. Both sides filed new motions this week about giving more strength to their arguments. WikiLeaks alleged source in chains. The guy who's been alleged to have leaked Vault 7, the CIA documents, to WikiLeaks, is under arrest, and his name is Joshua Schulte. And his lawyers have asked the government to show classified documents to him for their defense, to prepare their defense, and they've allowed him to go into a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF. It's just totally sealed chamber that can be built even in a courtroom or anywhere. There's one in Congress, in the Capitol. CIA obviously has them. So in this court or wherever this took place, this suspect, Joshua Schulte, if he wants to go in there, he has to be bolted to the floor and will be subjected to strip searches as he leaves. This is how they're treating a guy who's only a suspect. If he wants to look, he and his lawyer want to look at classified information to prepare their defense. That's how they're treating him. A man who's not been convicted of anything. And we then have the last thing, and Kathy Vogan, I thank her for sending this to me, this Integrity Initiative, this network that was exposed a few weeks ago of journalists, of people in government, in business, working together to try to counter quietly what they call Russian disinformation. They're now claiming in a testimony to the House of Commons, to a subcommittee in the House of Commons in London, that the reason why Julian Assange opposed Catalan independence was because he was working with the Russians on a plot. And it was shortly after that that the Ecuadorian government shut off his internet access and phone access, that they're jamming a considerable price so he cannot connect to the outside world. And they then declared that he could get that back. That was about a month ago, but only if he didn't speak about politics, because he was speaking badly about friendly countries like Spain and the United States. So Spain clearly was a reference to Julian Assange's strong support on the internet for Catalan independence. So this now they're portraying this initiative group in their testimony in the House of Commons as this is a Russian plot. It wasn't Julian Assange's own real views on this issue. No, the Russians, of course, stirred up again. Yet one more example when people in the establishment feeling threatened by popular uprisings, let's not forget France, the insurgencies in the American elections, they feel threatened. They must blame what's going on, not on their own failed policies that are now boomeranging on them because there's social unrest building, but on a foreign hostile power, namely Russia in this case. With that, I want to introduce John Kiriakou with your thoughts, John, over the last developments last week. And John, please repeat, if you can, what happened to your radio program? This, in light of what I just said, when there is legitimate criticism of a government agency or anyone in power, they blame Russia, and they did that with your show loud and clear directly because of one segment that you have on criminal justice.
it's true, and it's extraordinarily disappointing, although not surprising, to tell you the truth. I have a show every day on the Sputnik Network with Brian Becker. It's called Loud and Clear. And to tell you the truth, I'm very proud of it. I want to preface this by saying that when I was first interviewed for this job, Sputnik approached me. They offered it to me. And I said, well, I don't know. It's owned by the Russian government. I said, if I took this job, I would want complete freedom to talk about any issue I wanted and to be able to criticize anybody I wanted, including Vladimir Putin. And they said, done. And I said, really? Are you willing to put it in writing? They said, yes, done. And they did. I've been there for almost a year and a half now. No one has ever asked me to say something or to not say something. No one has ever asked me to take a certain position. I have utter and complete freedom to say anything that I want. So with that in mind, Brian and I decided to do a weekly segment for 30 minutes every Thursday. It runs from 4:30 to 5 o'clock Eastern time every day, called Criminal Injustice, in which we look at the criminal justice system across the country. We look at things like sentencing reform, criminal justice reform, and frankly, we look a lot at crooked cops and crooked prosecutors and crooked judges. And these things are just a part of everyday life. These are a fact of the American justice system. Well, wouldn't you know, last week, the Washington Post publishes an article, quite a long article, in which it quotes a new study written by two eggheads from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. One of these people is a former Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration. And they point out our show in particular by name. They mention the segment Criminal Injustice by name. And their conclusion is that because we are on a Russian station and we are criticizing the American judicial system, that we are weakening democracy itself. We're damaging the American democratic system. My initial reaction was to laugh. I mean, it's laughable. It's ridiculous. But, you can't laugh because people are serious about this kind of thing. This is how upside down we've become in Washington. It's another Red Scare all over again. And I have friends who consider themselves to be lifelong progressives who will look at you straight in the eye and say that Russia is the greatest threat to the United States and to the American way of life today. And I don't know whether to laugh or to cry, because if they had any idea that they were being propagandized, they would be disgusted with themselves. But this is what we're up against. Joe, you live it every day just like I do. Ray McGovern lives it every day. I see Ray's joined us as well. And so, I wish that we could get the word out to everybody. I wish that we could explain to people and educate people as to how preposterous this is and how damaging it is to our way of life. If anything is a threat to our democracy, it's this neo-fascism that we're getting from what is ostensibly the left. And it's extraordinarily disappointing to me.
It's really troubling, that story, because as you point out, you're just criticizing the justice system, which is the right to criticize that is fundamental to journalism and to our free speech rights here. And for them to say that any criticism against them is illegitimate because it's Russian inspired or Russian controlled. And that's what Julian Assange, of course, has been increasingly faced with now in this case of the Catalan independence. But in general, he's the one who is a Russian operative because he got the leaked emails and he published them to hurt Clinton and to help Trump, and where he made it clear he was opposed to both candidates. It's just troubling, to say the least. Let me bring Sean in from the Yale Privacy Lab if you have some thoughts on any of this.
Sure. Thank you. And the observation is really important. That all said, and I'm quite aware, believe me, of how strong the feeling is amongst progressives that Russia has somehow, taken over our most democratic institutions. I understand all of that, but I want to preface this, and I think we need to center ourselves and really think about this. Whatever one thinks about Russian state, Russian media, Russian television, conflating that issue with Julian's rights as a political prisoner is a problem, right? And this whole dialogue that has happened because of the fact that Hillary Clinton, who was a demagogue and a terrible candidate, as the Podesta emails showed, which we know of, the fact that she lost the election has absolutely nothing to do with what Julian's opinions are, whether he has the right to express himself, whether he has the right to meet with someone like Paul Manafort. Right, I kind of take an umbrage to the idea that he can't meet with someone. It doesn't mean that he's politically aligned with someone just because they show up at the embassy. Now, we know this didn't happen, so it's a complete joke, right? And we know that it's a terrible propaganda campaign against him. But we need to kind of push back a little bit against these assumptions. Someone who is extremely vulnerable, who's been living, 8 years in a confined situation, whatever opinions they have or don't have are not important to me. I consider myself extremely left. I consider myself an anarchist. I have a lot of problems with what people like Putin and so on do. I don't accept the traditional narrative about Russian intervention in our election. I think all of that is problematic. But sidetracking the conversation into this area is wrong. And as far as accusing, anyone who has some sort of ties to Russian media as being, a propagandist, that's absurd. We don't look at the BBC, right, and say, well, the BBC is UK state propaganda, right? And yet, RT and some of these other outlets, just because there's some tangential ties to a nation state, we're supposed to think that's some kind of a problem. So to me, the whole thing's a joke. It's really sad. I fully agree on the Red Scare stuff. It's I grew up in a when I was a child at the tail end of the Cold War, what we thought was the tail end of the Cold War, and now to see it being reignited in this way is really problematic. Complete joke, complete sidetracking. And then also I will say, we have to understand that some of the releases that WikiLeaks has done do show that American intelligence has the ability to pretend to be Russian. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily happening in a specific circumstance. I'd have to look at it, right? But the Vault 7 releases we're talking about show, for example, that one of the methods that was used in these attacks is pretending to show Cyrillic text or like bad translations of Russian and injecting this stuff into internet attacks. We just need to be very careful about all of this and just not be blaming one nation state or another. Certainly not looking at anyone who's talking about truth over the airwaves as if there's some kind of Russian spy. And it's really disgusting to me to see that, wonderful luminaries who have done great investigative journalism are now being sort of painted with this broad brush as being, Reds or Russians or whatever we're going to call them these days. I suppose the word commie hasn't come back yet as a slur, but it's pretty much that level of intellectual idiocy to talk about people that way.
Well, I a bit older than you, not as old as Ray McGovern, but I do remember the Vietnam War. And at that time, anybody was protesting. There was a whole period where they were smeared as commies and being influenced by the Russian government or by the Chinese, that they were spies, etc. So this is a revival again of that if you criticize legitimately the behavior of the state, our state, any part of it, you're going to be tarred to protect themselves from that legitimate criticism. And trying to link Julian Assange to the WikiLeaks, the leak that he somehow colluded. And the issue is the real center point of the charges and allegations of Russiagate is the collusion narrative. They've not been able to prove any of that yet. They're getting guys on lying to the FBI or financial crimes. But they are now trying to resurrect this idea that there was a conduit, there was communication between Julian Assange and Jerome Corsi, this journalist, if I can call him that, and Roger Stone, the political operative, because they may have known in advance that these emails were going to be published. Well, so what? I have to ask this question. Did they participate in the hacking or the stealing of these emails and send them over to Assange? Were they in? That was the crime that was committed, the stealing of the emails. That's a crime. Publishing is not a crime. But getting, or shouldn't be anyway, getting those documents. And they're not really suggesting that. They're just suggesting that they were told in advance. So what? Anyway, I'm going to bring Ray McGovern in because Ray, if you have unmuted your mic, could talk a lot more about the Vault 7 issue that that Sean just raised. You've written extensively on that, Ray. Welcome to the show tonight. I don't think we could hear you, Ray. Could anybody else hear him?
I cannot, no.
What's happened to me?
So while we're waiting, if you don't mind me just adding, I think you're 100% right, Joe, on that whole situation. I just want to add, it's really important to say that there's such a chilling effect amongst security researchers, right, to even question the Russian narrative, and that's problematic. And on top of that, to me, I don't care whether or not one nation or another provides information to WikiLeaks. If the information is true and has a value for the public should know it. And that, to me, is the most important thing. So even if the emails had originated from Russian intelligence somehow, I would still want to know what was going on inside the Hillary Clinton campaign. And I would hope that all of the millions of people who backed Bernie Sanders would want to know how much he got screwed in that election. So.
Ray, are you with us? I don't see Ray. Just to follow up on that, I totally agree with you. As a reporter for more than 30 years for big corporate newspapers, if somebody gave me something, of course you want to know what their motive is, but if you look at the documents, particularly documents, not statements, oral statements, and you can vet them that they're true and accurate, you're going to use them no matter what the person's motive was, because it's newsworthy if it's true. That's the issue, not the motive necessarily. Of course, you have to check out the motive because they can give you false information to pursue their interest. Now, even giving truthful information could be because obviously they're pursuing their own interest. That's why intelligence people leak stuff to the New York Times and Washington Post. It's in the government or the CIA's or FBI's interest to do that. But again, if it's true, then the government newspaper should publish it. The problem is when we have unnamed intelligence officials, we don't know whether it's true because the journalists have not vetted that. They don't put it in context. They just write it as if it's news, as they wrote it down. Ray, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you
okay.
Hear me now?
Yes, I can.
I forgot to put myself in Chrome.
Oh, now we got you. You look good in Chrome. All right.
Let me pick up first on Sean's reference to conflating. Conflating WikiLeaks with the DNC, Democratic National Committee, emails. Now, that was a big deal when the so-called intelligence community assessment came out, because they were very clear. It was not only the Russians, it was Vladimir Putin himself that authorized the hacking. And that was the genesis of the whole thing. Now, what I like to point out to people who haven't followed as closely as some of us have, President Obama was briefed on this, the intelligence community assessment. Now, I have to, again, emphasize that only one of those words is correct. It was an assessment. It wasn't intelligent, and it wasn't a community effort. It was hand-picked analysts by James Comey, okay? So let's put that into perspective right there. Now, when that came out, it looked very, very damaging, of course, because the CIA, NSA, and the FBI said it happened. And so they briefed President Obama on the 5th of January, 2017. And they said, here it is, Mr. President, you ordered this up. We're gonna brief President-elect Trump tomorrow. This is what we found. High confidence. We're just still assessing. We can't prove it, but it was actually Putin that did this. Okay, so I can see Obama sitting down in there and said, yeah, right, Clapper, the whole gang of four, right, okay. Well, the proof is in the pudding. It's a very key thing as to whether Russian interference, if there was, had any link with WikiLeaks. And what did Obama say, 13 days later, on the 18th of January, 2017? He said, and this is a quote, the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to how Russian hacking got to WikiLeaks are inconclusive, end quote. So you have inconclusive conclusions from the mouth of the sitting president 2 days before he leaves office. Now, why would he say something like that? Well, I had a chance to ask James Clapper, the principal briefer, the head of national intelligence, that very question 1 month ago. I said, how do you explain that the president sort of contradicted you just 13 days later? And Clapper said, I can't explain that. Can't explain that. Well, hold on, it's pretty key, isn't it? So if you can't prove, if you don't even have evidence that there was Russian hacking, which there isn't evidence of, and once you prove that, if you can't prove a link between Russian hacking and WikiLeaks, well, you're nowhere. And Americans don't know that, okay? That's a really fundamental problem. So as you know, Joe, and Sean, perhaps you know this too, we have in our group, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, 2 former technical directors of NSA. Whoa. Yeah, they left. They left because they were fed up with the shenanigans that were going on there. Now, what did they say? Well, they looked at some forensics done by independent forensicators, okay? They looked at them and they determined that what's represented as a Russian hack can't be a Russian hack. And the principle is very simple. I'll just explain it very, very briefly. It has to do with the physics principle of liquid dynamics, okay? Fluid dynamics. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you have a pipe, right, and you have a certain diameter or certain dimensions to this pipe, then the water can't flow any faster through this pipe except as it's limited by these dimensions. Now, the internet's a pipe, okay? And we know what the internet was capable of flowing through in July of 2016. And the so-called download from the internet, the hack, was downloaded at a speed 3 times, count them, 3 times faster than the internet was capable. What does that mean? That means that it was copied onto a thumb drive and then, distributed. That's what we think happened with the DNC emails. We think Seth Rich, yeah, I'll say Seth Rich. I mean, this is not a conspiracy theory. There's lots of evidence that it was Seth Rich, disenchanted by what he saw in the DNC emails, put a little thumb drive into the DNC computer, got him out to somehow, priority mail maybe, to Julian Assange or one of his lieutenants. That's key, okay? And then the other things, gosh, there's so much else that could be commented on. Joe, you asked me to talk about Vault 7.
Yeah, well, Sean brought it up, yep.
Yeah. Now, this is maybe interesting. It is interesting to me. I go on RT, I go on Sputnik, I go on any place that asks me. They used to ask me at CNN and CBS and the McNeil Lehrer show in those days, but they don't ask me anymore. I can't understand it, right? Okay.
Why would they?
So RT calls me usually around noon. They've had their morning meeting. They want me to come in at 3 o'clock to do a little, okay, I do 5 minutes of whatever. This time, they call me at 7 in the morning it was the 31st of March, 2017. So we're going, hello, it's RT. Can you come right in? I said, I beg your pardon? It's RT. I said, well, wait a second. You're not even open now. What do you mean? I said, is it a crank call? He's, no. Look, we just sent you an email. Read it. It's about Vault 7 marble framework. So I said, okay. Call me back in 10 minutes. So I read this thing. And I'm like, God, it shows that this capability, marble framework, was used during 2016, okay? And that it allowed a entity to hack into a computer or a server, disguise who hacked in, and leave little telltale signs like, 5 languages: Chinese, Korean, Arabic, Farsi, and Cyrillic, Russian. And sure enough, there was some telltale signs there. Okay, now I say, all right, I'll be right in, but you open? I said, no, you have to use the Eurovision studios. Okay, so I get in my car, for the cause, I'm driving down the carpool lane, hoping that I don't get gigged for this. I get in there, but then I say, well, wait a second, what am I going to say about this? I mean, I got to call Bill Binney. So I did. Now, Bill Binney is one of the former technical directors of NSA. I said, Bill, do you know about this thing? You know about this marble framework, or you could do these things? He says, oh, yeah, sure. That started when I was still on active duty at NSA. I said, well, tell me about it. He says, well, Ray, what you need to know is that it includes 700 million. Got that, Ray? 700 million lines of code. So history major McGovern says, Bill, that sounds like a lot of code. But he says, oh, yeah, Ray. Look, can you still do arithmetic or mathematics? Can you multiply? I say, yeah. Well, each line of code costs $25. Okay, Ray? Do the math, all right? Wow. So when you go in there, you tell them that I knew when this thing started. NSA, of course, had the brains behind the whole thing, but the CIA took it, and they're the ones that implement these things. And Brennan set up a whole directorate. When I was at CIA, there were only 3 directorates. So there's a 4th directorate for cyber warfare. Oh, so I had a story. So I told RT, I told Sputnik, who asked me later, and another local radio station, but nobody else was interested. And guess what? Even though earlier tools that were described by Vault 7 were reported with a vengeance in the New York Times and the Washington Post, things like a tool that allows somebody to take control of the car, go 110 miles an hour, boom, Actually, that happened in Los Angeles, okay? Another tool, you think your TV is off, right? But it's really on, and it's recording everything goes on in your bedroom or wherever in your house, okay? So those were tools that were announced on the 7th of March, and they were played up big. These are exciting stories, right? And guess what happens on the 31st of March? Well, you know how it works. New York Times goes to the White House or goes to the CIA and says, oh, gosh, we want to, this is quite a story. No, don't do it. Sources and methods, so it'd be terrible. So not a word of this appeared in the New York Times or any of the major publications, except there was one person that didn't get the memo. That was Ellen Nakashima for the Washington Post. She wrote a superb article. A really good article, and it appeared in the Post, but then they didn't say another word about it. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that number one, you can't prove, and Obama admitted as much, you can't prove a link between WikiLeaks and the DNC emails via a hack from Russia. Okay, you can't identify a link between Russia and WikiLeaks. So why do they do that? Well, Sean already talked about that. They want to get Julian Assange for a whole host of other reasons. Now, is this fair? Of course, it's not fair. But how it's playing out is that everyone cites this intelligence community assessment, okay, that really actually said in the assessment that no, these aren't facts. These are, we're not sure, okay, but everybody takes that as gospel. And Bob Mueller has become Saint Robert Mueller, last I heard, he was born of a virgin. I mean, the guy is, pretty good. So that's what's going on here, and it's really hard to know about, hard to realize how much pressure Julian Assange is under. Let's see. I want to say one more thing about that, and that is that I was with Julian 3 days before the November election in 2016. I had done a little talk or a debate at Oxford, and I came down and we had dinner together, obviously where he's holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. He was completely spent, okay? He had this pallor about him that made it look like he hadn't been outside for 4 years, which happened to be the case, okay? But he was exuberant. And Hillary Clinton's name never came up. What was he exuberant about? He was exuberant about the fact that he had been interviewed by John Pilger, and John Pilger had gone out and got it placed, the interview. This is 3 days before the election, right? This is hard, cold fact. This is the kind of currency that Julian Assange deals in. Now, the only negative there was that John Pilger tried to give it to the BBC. We want that. Tried to give Channel 4. Sky News. Nah. So he had to give it to RT, okay? And that was less than ideal. But RT was the only that's what it is. RT was the only place where he could get it published. But it was published. Now, in our little conversation, we really don't talk much substance, but there was not the foggiest hint that, as the caricature would have it, that Julian said, now I got Hillary, now I got Hillary. Now. He just wanted the facts out. Now, the last thing I'll say, it's already been said, I think, is that Julian deals in unvarnished facts, okay? What he has is what investigative journalists, what detectives lust after, okay? Documents, verified documents. Is Vault 7 under any suspicion? No, the CIA has admitted that they're genuine documents. So this is a big thing. And the ironic thing is that in this intelligence community assessment dated January 6, 2017, the day after Obama was, they tried to persuade him to believe it, that assessment says the Russians gave it to WikiLeaks because WikiLeaks enjoys this reputation for not changing anything but being very authentic. Talk about a left-handed compliment, All right. So here it is, authentic. Here it is, documentary. What did it say? And that's the key here. It said that Hillary Clinton stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Pure and simple. And why did they do the Russian thing? Well, they thought that Trump was vulnerable on Russia, but when they knew that Julian was going to publish these things, then it became a big deal. And so on the 22nd of July, 2016, when WikiLeaks finally published this after 6 weeks of ordering it and, checking it out, okay, that was 3 days before the convention. What did the New York Times say the next day? Why did the Russians do this? Why did the Russians hack into the DNC? Why the Russians? And the whole thing, nobody says, hey, what's in those emails? Maybe we ought to read if they're authentic, maybe we ought to read them. It was what I call a magnificent distraction. It worked, and they thought it would work throughout the rest of the campaign. Of course, now it's backfiring, and we're seeing that Russiagate is really turning very gradually, it was clear this time last year, into FBI deep state gate. I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Ray. I'm going to bring in John, but before I do that, I don't know if you were on when I mentioned that the alleged source of the Vault 7 leak, former CIA agent, if he and his lawyer want to go into a SCIF to look at classified documents to prepare their defense, that the suspect is required to be shackled to the ground and to be strip searched on the way out of the thing. So that's how they treat the suspects. Now, John, you worked in the same shop as Ray did. Can you want to weigh in on anything that's been said so far?
Yeah, I'd like to. Well, first of all, I think Ray's right on every single one of those details. This is a story that needs to be told, that's not been told, or when it is told, it's told incorrectly. I also want to echo something that you said, Joe. This Vault 7 situation is bad. And it's bad because Joshua Schulte, the CIA officer who's been arrested. Now, remember that for a whistleblower to be a whistleblower, the criteria are very clear. You have to have brought to light any evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety. Motivation is irrelevant. We don't know what his motivation was. I don't care what his motivation was. If he brought to light evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, the guy's a whistleblower. So what was he arrested for? He was arrested for possession of child pornography, not on espionage charges, not in the beginning. Possession of child pornography. Now, did he have child pornography? I have no idea. The feds said that Matt DeHart had child pornography on his computer when he was arrested after blowing the whistle in the military. And in fact, there was no such thing on his computer. The judge asked to see the evidence of child porn. There was zero, literally zero evidence of child porn. The judge threw that count out and told the government not to ever do something like that again. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that this is a pattern. What drives the government crazy in whistleblowing cases, Joe, is when the public pays attention and support for the whistleblower begins to grow. And so how do you separate the whistleblower from his natural constituency, from those who would automatically support him? You charge him with a child sex crime. What could possibly be worse than a child sex crime? But we know now that they make it up. So they charged Josh Schulte with a sex crime. Now they've added multiple counts of espionage. You're right that the new rules, and we know this because he wrote a letter to his judge, the new rules dictate that he be taken manacled, shackled, leg chains, a chain around the midsection, handcuffs, and then the handcuffs are chained to the chains. All right, this is how they do it. He's taken in chains, in manacles, to the SCIF. Now, the SCIF is in the Justice Department's building in New York. He's only allowed to go there from 9 to 5. Now, the Justice Department prosecutors can work 24 hours a day, and believe me, they do. He can only be there with his lawyer from 9 to 5. Not only is he strip searched on the way in and on the way out, but he has to be chained to an eye bolt in the floor so he can't move. His lawyer has to be searched going in and going out. That's unprecedented. And then on top of that, they have CCTV cameras inside the vault to watch him at all times. Now, purportedly, there is no listening device, but we don't know. There's also an FBI agent that has to be in the vault with him at all times, but the FBI agent is on his honor not to report back to the prosecutors what he and his attorney are talking about. You know, this isn't justice. I'm going to tell you something that my attorney told me. I had Judge Leonie Brinkema in my case. Judge Brinkema is the same judge that Julian would have if he were to be returned to the United States, and I pray to God he's not. But with Judge Brinkema, the fix is in. She was a longtime federal prosecutor before coming to the bench. She was a Reagan appointee, and then she was elevated in the Clinton administration, but only at the request of John Warner, who was a Republican, conservative Republican senator. So she has prosecution in her soul. There's nothing friendly about her, especially in a national security case. Well, Judge Brinkema, in my case, scheduled a hearing for us. We made 70 separate motions at one point to declassify 70 documents that were necessary for my defense. And we blocked off 3 days in order to argue these 70 motions. We walked into the courtroom and she said, I'm going to make everybody's job very easy. I'm going to deny all 70 of these motions. She said to me, I don't think you need a single one of these documents to defend yourself. Well, these documents were the only defense that I had. So instead of 3 days, we were out of court in 5 minutes. And as we were leaving the courtroom, I said to my lawyer, my lead attorney, what just happened in there? And he turned to me and he said, we just lost the case. That's what happened. And I said, so what do we do now? And he said, now we negotiate a plea. I said, I'm not negotiating a plea because I didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to go to trial. And he stopped me and he said, you know what your problem is? Your problem is that you think this is about justice. This isn't about justice. This is about mitigating damage. And he was exactly right. And that wasn't true just of me. That's true of all of us. Whether it's Ray McGovern getting arrested for exercising his constitutional right to freedom of speech, or Julian Assange blowing the whistle on war crimes and crimes against humanity, or Josh Schulte posting purportedly classified documents in the public interest. It's not about justice. There is no justice, not in this system. It's about mitigating damage. And in a system like that, we can't win.
It's hard.
Sorry, downer.
Yeah, hard to follow up after that, John. Were you ever shackled in that way? You described it as if you had been.
Oh, yes, I was multiple times. I broke my finger in prison at one point, and they wouldn't treat it. And so my arm was swollen all the way up to my elbow, swollen like I couldn't bend my fingers, I couldn't move my hand. And then finally, after 16 days, they decided to take me out for an X-ray. And so they shackled me like that. And worse than that, it's not just the shackling. They strip you naked, they do a body cavity search, and then they put you in a uniform made out of paper. And so it's barely on you, right? And then over the paper uniform, that's when they put all the chains and the shackles and the manacles around your ankles. And they take you out like that. It was the dead of winter, right? This was the first week of February that they took me out like this. It's snow and ice everywhere. I don't have a coat because I'm not allowed to have a coat because I could, I guess, hide something in the coat, I suppose. So I'm in this paper uniform, naked underneath, shackled. They take me to the doctor. The doctor does an X-ray and he said, you know, your finger's broken, your hand is broken. Normally I would set it, but you broke it so long ago, it's already begun to heal itself. So he said, sorry, buddy. And I still can't bend my finger. It won't bend. But I mean, that was minor compared to what some of these other guys are going through. But this is what Josh Schulte has to go through every time he wants to see his attorneys. Every single time.
And he's not been convicted of anything yet.
No, he's not been convicted of anything.
Yeah, and that's how they're treating him.
Mm-hmm.
What could Julian Assange look forward to if he should ever get into the hands of these people?
Oh, literally nothing good. I can tell you what my first day was like. I turned myself into the FBI on a Monday morning. The FBI actually tried to arrest me on a Thursday. And they do that on purpose. They try to make their arrests on Thursdays because federal courts don't arraign anybody on Fridays. And so if you're arrested on Thursday, you have to spend Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night in the DC jail, where you're going to get softened up a little bit by a couple of the guys in there. Because you're wearing a suit, you're a white middle-class guy, middle-aged guy. And so you're going to have a tough 4 days. That's exactly what they want. They want you to be beaten. They want you to be humiliated so that you're more likely to take a quick plea deal just to get out of that situation. So the only thing that saved me is on that Thursday afternoon, I said, I want to see my attorneys and I want to see them right now. That was the only thing that saved me because they had to let me see my attorneys. So I turned myself in on Monday. They handcuffed me in the lobby of the FBI Washington field office. They walked me 30 feet and then uncuffed me. I took mug shots and fingerprints, and then they chained me to a bench, to a metal bench. I sat there for 3 hours, and I was chained just with cuffs. So I had to sit like this cuffed to the foot of the bench. I couldn't sit up straight for 3 hours like this. Then they put me in an SUV, cuffed behind my back, so that I couldn't sit back. I had to sit leaning forward while they're peeling through the streets of Washington, and I'm being tossed all over the back of the SUV, which I learned later they also do on purpose. And then they took me into the basement of the federal building in Alexandria, Virginia. This is where Julian would be charged. And then they turn you over to the marshals. So I had never worked with the marshals before. I don't know any marshals. I had never had any professional interaction with the marshals. So I walked in, and I'm in a suit, tie, everything, cuffed behind my back. And this marshal, who could not possibly have been more than 20 years old, shouts, "Up against the wall, motherfucker!" And he pushes me, throws me up against the wall. So I slammed into the wall. And I said, "Oh, so this is how it's going to be, huh, tough guy?" And that just made him angrier, or faux angrier, whatever it was. And I decided, if he's going to be a dick to me, I'm going to be a dick to him. So I kept calling him kid, which just enraged him. And then my punishment was they chained me to the bench again in the holding cell. There were 4 of us in this holding cell. I was the only one who was chained. And of the other 3 guys, 2 were child molesters who had been caught at the Iwo Jima, laying in the bushes for children. And one was a Chinese drug smuggler. So I was the only one chained. At one point, I said, "Listen, I'm diabetic. I've been in here for like 6 hours. I'm starting to get the shakes. I got to have carbs. I have to have something to get my blood sugar up." And they threw a bologna sandwich at me, which, came apart in the air and was on the floor. And one of the child molesters picked it up and gave it to me. And then finally they put me in a single cell, again, still cuffed. I was able to talk to one of my attorneys through like a little confessional window, but with little tiny bars in it. And then they took my tie and my shoestrings after the fact, after all this was over. So I went into court with no tie and no shoestrings. And then the last thing, and let this be a lesson to Julian too, because these guys, they think they're so smart and they're not. I was arraigned. I pled not guilty. And then they said, "You need to go to the marshal's office. They need for you to sign some papers before you leave." Well, yeah, what's it take? 5 seconds, 10 seconds maybe to sign some papers? But what they do is they make you sit there for hours so that the media that's waiting for you outside, after they interview the prosecutors who walk out of the courtroom, they get tired of waiting for you and they pack up and they go home. So when you finally leave 3 hours later, there's nobody out there to get your side of the story. Well, my lawyers were smart enough to know this. So they said to me, "Look, they're going to make you sit here for the rest of the afternoon. Let's go outside now. There's nothing to keep you in here. We'll go outside now. We're going to tell every reporter in Washington what our side of the story is, and then we'll come back and sign the papers." Well, the marshals saw us leaving. We'd only been in that office for 5 minutes. The marshals saw us leaving and said, "Hey, you can't leave." And one of my attorneys turned around and said, "You show me the statute that says we can't leave. Go ahead and look it up because we're going to be back in a half an hour." So we left. I gave an interview to, everybody in Washington was out there waiting. And then I went back in. They made me sit for another hour. And then I signed my documents and left. I fear that Julian will not have the luxury of leaving. They'll probably lock him up and keep him locked up. And, I hope Julian is watching this, or I guess he can't because he doesn't have internet access, but I hope he hears about it because I'm going to repeat.
31 hours.
I'm going to repeat advice that I've tried to convey to him in other venues. If there's anything that you can do to stay out of the Eastern District of Virginia, do it. Because you will not get a fair trial here. The deck is stacked. I was so panicked about being wronged in the Eastern District that I hired a jury consultant. And this jury consultant happened to be the uncle of my best friend's wife. And so his $10,000 a day fee, he cut it to zero. He did it out of the goodness of his heart. This guy was O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. He was William Kennedy Smith's jury consultant. He was George Zimmerman's jury consultant. So this is the real deal. So he came up to Washington. He lives in Dallas. And we got him a security clearance so he could read the background of my case. And then we all got together. Now, I was not allowed to see my attorneys anywhere except in the Justice Department's classified conference room. This is what Josh Schulte is going through, and this is how it's going to be for Julian as well. You cannot speak to your attorneys in their office because the government's going to argue that everything that you have to say is classified, and so you have to talk to them in the Justice Department's conference room, which of course is bugged. Of course they have access to the computer that you're working on. Of course they know what your strategy is. So you can't win in that respect. So anyway, the Eastern District of Virginia, I forget exactly. I forget what I was saying, Joe. I keep going off on these tangents and now I forget.
That's fine.
No, tell me what was my point.
Well, you were saying that you would hope that Julian Assange does everything he can to stay out of that.
Yeah. So, the jury consultant. So he comes up and he reviews the case. We have 15,000 pages of classified documents. And finally he says to me, listen, if we were in any other district in America, we'd win this thing. He said, you haven't done anything wrong. You haven't broken the law. But the Eastern District of Virginia, they don't call it the espionage court for nothing. No national security defendant has ever won a case, ever, in the Eastern District of Virginia. I said, so what are you telling me to do? He said, I'm telling you to take the deal. And so I had to take the deal. Now, the only reason that I was as lucky as I was is because my lawyers were geniuses. The Washington Post called my attorneys legal titans. They said that they were the best white-collar criminal defense attorneys in Washington. That says a lot. And so they negotiated something for me called an 11C1C plea. This is another thing that I want to convey to Julian. An 11C1C plea is an agreement between the prosecution and the defense that's written in stone. It cannot be changed. It can be rejected, but it cannot be changed. And so rather than face 45 years, or realistically, as my attorney said, 18 years, my attorneys negotiated 2.5 years, of which I would do 23 months. That was an 11C1C, and it went to the judge as a take it or leave it proposition. So when she received it, she read it right there up at the bench, and she looked at me, she told me to stand, and she said, I have been a judge since 1986. This is the first 11C1C plea I have ever had. She said, I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. And if it were up to me, I would give you the maximum. And I thought to myself, well, it actually is up to you. Because if you weren't all talk, you could reject it and I could go to trial. And I could talk about the hideous shit that I saw at the CIA in the 15 years that I was there, the last 7 being in counterterrorism operations, and you can imagine how filthy those are. So I just stood there and I thought to myself, so if you don't like it, then reject it. And she says, but my hands are tied and I'm forced to accept it. And she accepted it. So instead of the government asking for 45 years and me doing 18 years and probably dying in prison, I ended up getting 2.5. I did 23 months and I came home. If Julian has any opportunity whatsoever to negotiate an 11C1C plea, he's got to do it. It'll be the only thing that saves him.
You don't think that's realistic that he'll be able to do that, do you?
Well, I think it is realistic because I think there's one thing that Julian has on his side that the government can't do a doggone thing about, and that's the notion of jury nullification. There are enough right-thinking people out there, especially in a well-educated, well-informed area like the Washington area, where there are going to be people called for jury selection who are going to say, this is nonsense. This guy did a public service. This guy exposed war crimes and crimes against humanity. Just because the government doesn't like him doesn't mean he belongs in prison. So I think the government ought to be worried about prospective jurors thinking, wait a minute, this Assange guy is a hero. He's not a criminal. And no matter what the government has to say, we're not going to vote to convict. I think that's a real possibility.
If they say that during jury selection, they won't get selected. They better keep
selected
themselves to the trial.
That's right. They would have
jury nullification is, of course, when the government can prove that the suspect broke the law, but the jury decides the law is unjust. Correct. It's the closest we have to a public defense, public interest defense that doesn't exist in the U.S. but does in the UK, where you could say, yes, he leaked the classified information, and that's technically against the law, but it was in the public interest. Can't mount that defense in the U.S., but that's the only thing we might be able to rely on is jury nullification. I just wanted to say, John, when you were talking about how you were treated that day, the irony of it, to these guys treating you like that, it didn't dawn on them that you were there because you had exposed torture, and that's how they were treating you. So it's really extraordinary.
And at one point, I was sitting in this chair before they put me in the cage. I was sitting in this chair, and one of the marshals said, "How do you spell your last name?" And just instinctively, I stood up to answer him, and he shouts at me, "Motherfucker! If you stand up one more time, I'm going to break your legs." And I said, "My God, man, does this make you feel manly talking to people? Like, what's the matter with you?" And so I sat back down. I was like, okay, so this is how it's going to be.
Thank you, John. I want to bring in former United States Senator Mike Gravel. He represented Alaska from 1969 to 1980. He's best known for having, hi, Mike. He's best known for having been given the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, who's been on this Vigil one time, at least one time before Dan has. Because Dan went to the press, and of course the government stopped in prior restraint, ultimately, the press from continuing to publish. So he went to a few senators, like George McGovern, who was running for president and didn't want anything to do with it, and a couple of other less courageous senators. And then he found Mike Gravel, who was willing to do it, and Mike read the papers into the congressional record during a subcommittee hearing. And the next day was the Supreme Court decision, actually, the very next morning, in which the court ruled that the Times and the Post were right, that they cannot be stopped prior to publication. They cannot be prior restraint, but the majority of the judges said that after publication of classified information, they are liable to be arrested. And that's key to the Assange case, because under the Espionage Act, technically, it's a horrific act, but technically they could get him just for the possession and dissemination of the documents. So, Mike, I know you're a supporter of Julian, and I see Dan Ellsberg right next to you. Dan has joined the show, but let's turn the mic over first to Mike. How are you, Mike? Can we hear you?
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Mike.
Yeah, you're the one that controls the mute. one of the things that
be careful what you say. I'll mute you.
I've never been careful what I say. I could care less about those mothers. But the key thing is, it's just surprising how sadistic these people are in the system. Sadistic is the word. You know, we used to laud ourselves that no American would ever act like a German at Auschwitz. Hell, we act like that all the time. And what just happened with John is a case in point. And what they did to Chelsea Manning in trying to break his spirit, and bless him that he has come out of this whole. And the only thing that I can say good about Obama is the pardon, but not much beyond that, because what Julian is facing is what Obama started, and I think that's not fully understood. The other thing, first off, let me tell Ray McGovern. Ray, whenever you're putting anything out about our organization, since I'm the oldest person at going on 89 in our organization, I want my name on there until I pass, okay? So,
okay.
So that's a given.
Your name is golden. Describe how we describe you in our veteran intelligence professionals for sanity memoranda. Your early experience as an intelligence person.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, Signal Corps, actually.
No, not the Signal Corps. No, I was fortunate. I was gun ho. I enlisted during the war in Korea, but one of the things I wanted is when I enlisted that I could pick, and I picked the intelligence committee. So I was sent to intelligence school at Fort Holabird, and then from there I was sent down to South Carolina, and we were just young men chasing girls, and this wasn't what I signed up for. So they had a circular out that you could go to OCS and they wouldn't extend your sign up, which was 4 years for me. So I went to OCS, the Combat Infantry Platoon situation, and of course Ellsberg well knows that the patch that we wore on was "Follow Me," and of course that's what served me when Ellsberg did what he did. Is, God damn it, he's gone up the hill. I got to follow him. And,
yes.
and that's what motivated me to do this. But one of the things that's not clearly understood is that when I was so I go to Europe, thank God, had I gone to Asia with my gun-ho attitude, I'd have got my ass shot off. There's no question about that. But so I go to Europe with this good fortune, and I go to the CIC, which is what my orders were. So I go in with my transfer papers to the CIC office, and they said, no, you don't belong here. And I said, what do you mean? No? See that room down the hall on the left? You go there, and then you deliver your papers there. So I go there, and on the door it says CIS, Communications Intelligence Service. And so here I am, a bright second lieutenant, really no experience, 2 years of college, and I'm the adjutant. Would you believe that? The position called for a captain, but for some reason in the IBM cards, I came up and I was the adjutant. What the hell? I was so green. Now, I could take top secret documents. I had several safes behind my desk, and whenever I couldn't afford to go out with my car on a weekend, I would go to the office and sit there, open up these top secret files and read through them. And it was ridiculous, the crap that was in there. And so I started burning these files because I had the authority to do that. And so here I was literally a top secret control officer. I could classify and declassify, and I was 24 years old, and green is all get out. And so now you advance it to I'm a U.S. Senator, and I'm going on 42 years old, and all I can do is go into a room under guard and read the Pentagon papers, and I couldn't take notes, and obviously no staff. This was ridiculous in my mind, terrible. And so when Dan called my office and spoke to me, I said, would I be willing to use it in my filibuster, because I was filibustering the draft at the time. And in a second, I said, yes. Please hang up, because I wasn't sure if he was being tailed or I was being tailed. So we did. We met subsequently, and in his movie, The Most Dangerous Man in America, they go through in some detail about what had happened between Dan and myself in the transfer of the documents. So those are my bona fides, to be in a group, and I want to exercise my bona fides that at 89, I think I'm the oldest person in a group, and you want to keep my name there until I pass. That could be at any time, or it could be 5 years from now, but I want to assert that. The other thing is that, as I pointed out at the beginning, I've always been struck by the sadistic nature of judges and the people in the police system. And the word is sadistic, because the way they treated John is sadism, in its brutal form. And for us, with our attitude that we Americans are so exceptional. It's shameful. It's shameful that this is permeated throughout our judicial system from top to bottom. And I've had occasion to, I'm not an attorney, but I did about 3 or 4 cases that I was involved in that I couldn't afford counsel. So I studied the law and did it pro se. And I'm very proud that I did pro se before the Ninth Circuit. And I won what I was after in the Ninth Circuit. I didn't get much justice because the people who were crushing me was the Carlyle Group. I don't know if you're aware of them, that how they used their position to get influence, like Carlucci, the Secretary of Defense, and others, and even had was it George Bush that went over to over there, and so I had my hands full, and I was crushed. But it hasn't changed my attitude one iota. I enjoy a good fight. And though at my age, I don't have the energy to fully enjoy it, but I want to get my oar in there. So Ray, I hold you responsible. If I see any of this stuff come up and my name's not on it, I'm going to hold you responsible. So yes. I see Dan there. I'll let him pick up on our relationship, which was that first phone call that he made, and I, in fact, I want to put a joke on Dan, is that Dan, he goes out and he suffers the indignity of being arrested every opportunity he gets, and he's totally committed to causes. I'm committed to the same causes, but I don't get out there and get myself arrested, because I, in my heart of hearts, view that protest is the guarantee that representative government is not working. And I don't even call ourselves democracies, which is bullshit. We're not even close to being a democracy. And so what I josh Dan on, because he's got so much more experience than I have in the intelligence effort, but I josh him on that he goes out there and protests because he's expiating his sins by once being for the war. Now, I was never for the war, so I got no sins to expiate. And even if I did, I'm a former Catholic, and I can't get credit for anything in that area. So let me turn it over to Mike, the great person who caused me to do the right thing, and that's Dan Ellsberg. Dan, you pick up from here.
Hi, Dan.
Great to see you, Mike, and Ray, my friends, and John Kiriakou and Joe Loria, who helped you, I know, on your book, a terrific book.
Yes, political honesty.
You remind me of that first phone call. I remember the words, I think, that I used when I talked to you, which were, Senator, is it true that you're planning to filibuster on the draft? Which was going to keep the draft postponed, at least as long as he filibustered, couldn't pass it. A renewal of the draft, wasn't that it? A reinstitution?
It was renewed in September when they broke my filibuster, because Mansfield wanted to let John Stennis save face and Nixon save face. So Nixon agreed to let the draft expire 2 years hence, which was 73. When 73 rolled around, I was still there. And John Stennis, being quite the honorable person, he held to the agreement that the draft would expire. So when I always say that I was instrumental in ending the draft, and that's the terminology that I use, instrumental, because they wouldn't let me get credit. And of course, Nixon got credit. But great about Nixon, in one of the books he wrote to try and rejuvenate himself before the American people, he wrote a paragraph saying that the worst mistake I ever made was agreeing to end the draft. So I enjoyed that.
Anyway, I was impressed that this senator, whom I didn't know, I'd read that he was going to filibuster. I had actually tested a couple people, I'll name names here, including Gaylord Nelson, who had voted against appropriations a few times in connection with the war and had raised questions about it. I was kind of testing him whether he was a person to go with the Pentagon Papers. And I tried one thing after another. He brushed them all off. Might he filibuster against the war? Might he do this and that? And he seemed pretty burnt out to me at that point. This was back in 1969.
Dan, let me add something there that could be helpful to you. Gaylord was one of the advisors of McGovern. And I had picked up that Gaylord, subsequently, Gaylord is the one that advised McGovern, don't do this. This will destroy your chances of becoming president. So I just want
from Fulbright when he told me that he had, listen, with Nelson, I got so disgusted with him finally, and I was going to see McGovern later. I was going to see McGovern later. So at the end, I got up and I said, Senator Nelson, you've done a lot on the war. You criticized it. There were times in my career when I wish I had done more than I did. And I hope, Senator, you don't finish your career feeling wrong that you had not done more than you've actually done. I left him in I wasn't in a good mood. And I went to see McGovern. And McGovern said he was going to use the Pentagon Papers. He had a very different attitude. And I went through the whole thing with him. But he said, give me a week to think about it. And at the end of that week, he did say he couldn't do it after all. And later when I asked him, I said, do you mind if we come and discuss at some point? I went in to see him maybe a few weeks later when I was in town. And he said that he had discussed this with a friend, his closest confidant, what you just said, and who had advised him that he shouldn't do it. And he said he guessed, he asked if it was your name. McGovern had earlier said nothing could compel him to reveal my name. You know, he showed the Constitution, speech clause, isn't it, that he can't be questioned about anything he said on the floor of Congress. He said, they can't even question me. They can't make me tell your name, whatever. And so he said, I did, however, tell a friend, and he asked me, was that Dan Ellsberg? And I said, was that Gaylord Nelson? And he had guessed from my little exchange with him that I was the bad guy who was trying to get him into bad waters there. And I didn't hold that against McGovern because he was running for president at that point. And I had said to him earlier that I knew it was very questionable for him to run for president, having put these out. And he said, my source of funding is different from these other guys, and the people who back me won't be bothered by it, he said. But a week later with Gaylord Nelson, he had changed his mind. So here is this guy, Gravel, now, who is going to stick his neck out. And by the way, a very good guy that I dealt with earlier, Senator Goodell, who had called for us to get out of Vietnam in 1 year and cut the fund off. He didn't. He couldn't get at first one co-sponsor to go with him. But when I raised the question later to him of a filibuster, he said, Dan, if I could get people to join me, I'd do it. He said, but if you do it as one person, you're going to look ridiculous. And in this job, you cannot afford to look ridiculous. So here was a Senator Gravel who was willing to look ridiculous if necessary, or all by himself. He wasn't asking anybody else to join. So I said, is it true you're going to do this? And you said, yes, I am going to do it. I said, well, if you really want to read stuff, I can give you enough to read till Christmas. It will keep you busy till Christmas.
And mind you, I'm dyslexic. So it would have been to New Year's.
Right. Actually, a lot more than that. It's tough reading, as you found when you were reading it into the record. Hard to read it. It was so terrible. In fact, I remember the point where you really gave up, where you said, we are sending people over there to die and to kill for a government of drug dealers, and pushers, basically, which was exactly right. And very hard to say. Okay, so you were very unusual at that point. You did face censure for it, as I recall. And wasn't it Mike Mansfield, I think, who interceded for you at that point?
Gerald Ford Gerald Ford with a bevy of Republicans went to see Mansfield over that weekend, and I hadn't seen Mansfield yet. And Mansfield, they walked in to see Mansfield, and they said, "Well, we want to talk to you about Gravel," and he immediately made the statement, "I don't know of anything wrong that Gravel has done."
Yeah.
And that was the end of the meeting. They just walked out because they knew they couldn't persuade the leader. Now,
Well,
I went to see him.
Later, you actually put, tried to put or did what you could to put this other top secret stuff, a national security study memorandum run into the Senate, and were blocked by it. And you'll recall that they actually assigned a committee. I think it was Javits and somebody else, maybe Gary Hart or somebody, was to look into the question of whether they could declassify in the Senate classified material. And they came back later in a closed session, which was, not allowed to be printed in the congressional record for a long time. Eventually it got declassified. And in that, they said, it's very strange. As far as we can tell, we do have the right to do this. It's not clear that we'd be breaking any law by doing it. Nevertheless, that didn't mean they were ready to do it. And when I asked Mike many years later, in 2006, when we had hoped to get an impeachment proceeding going against George W. Bush, and Representative Conyers had not only promised that he would hold impeachment hearings, but he had written a book about it, How to Impeach the President, that summer. And he was told by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, when the new term started, you will not proceed with impeachment proceedings, on the grounds that that would bring the Republicans in and would doom the prospects of any new president. We're reliving that right now, obviously. I would say the same issues are arising, and we'll see how that works out. But I was so disappointed that how little we got out of the 2006 class that came in there. The Democrats took the House then, remember? Just like now. And we got very, very little out of that from the Democrats. And I remember asking Mike on that question, Mike, do you think these are extraordinarily cowardly congressmen? And he said, no, ordinarily cowardly. He said it was exactly the same 40 years ago. And so it goes. Now, to get into the question of how this relates to Julian right now, Assange, what he's facing is not only the kind of treatment that John received in prison, but I think it's almost sure that, and I think, by the way, John, you did experience, tell me if I'm wrong, some disciplinary issues where you were put in isolation for a while. Is that true?
No, I was threatened with isolation a number of times, threatened with solitary confinement. And it was because I was writing a blog from prison. And for the life of them, they couldn't figure out how I was getting it out. And the truth of the matter is that I was putting it in an envelope, addressing it to one of my
What? Truth of the matter is what? I didn't hear it.
Oh, they couldn't figure out how I was getting this blog out of prison. But the truth is I was just sticking it in an envelope, putting a stamp on it, and throwing it into the mailbox.
All right. Well,
they're sadistic, but they're not very bright either.
They're not.
The analogy there, so given what I've said already, I have to leave Julian aside for just a minute and tell this analogous story. When Mike was going to put this National Security Study Memorandum 1, the answers to it, which were answers to questions on Vietnam, that were extremely embarrassing, written the questions by somebody who, as they say in the Pentagon, knew where the bodies were buried. So the answers were very embarrassing to the administration, potentially, if they got out. So I gave them to Mike Gravel, and he tried to put them, as I just said, into the congressional record, and they blocked him. This is classified information. We can't put that in the record. Then on May 3rd, 1972, there was an event where we were having a rally. It was during the offensive in Vietnam of 1972. The ARVN, our mercenaries, in effect, people we were paying and equipping, were fleeing from Hue and Da Nang south, discarding their helmets and their boots as they ran, which seemed very strange to people. When they read stories about it, they said, what's going on? What is this giving? And I said, having spent 2 years in Vietnam and worked with ARVN troops, I said, I know exactly what they're doing. This is on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972. And I gave a talk about it to a good rally crowd. I said, I know exactly what they're doing. They are throwing away American helmets and American boots, which they are wearing. because A, they don't want to be caught, make it clear that they were in Arvin, the people who were working basically for a foreign government, the United States, and that unlike the Viet Cong or unlike the North Vietnamese army, they were wearing the uniform of foreigners. And that was not something they wanted to be caught with exactly. So it's kind of a...
David, let me interrupt a minute.
Yeah.
Is that meeting that you're talking about at the Capitol, that's when the plumbers were supposed to break your legs, right?
That's right. At that very time, you were giving us talk. Ron Dellums was there. Bella Abzug was there. There are a number of people, including some Hollywood people, talking. And it occurred to me, and they had brought up, I didn't know this at the time, but as we were all there on the steps of the Capitol, there were 12 CIA assets, as they call them, from the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Americans who'd been in the Bay of Pigs, who were brought up from Miami with the first money. Actually, the illegal campaign contribution from Dwayne Andreas was spent to take them up to DC. They were showing my picture, and a couple others said, your job is to incapacitate Ellsberg totally. I knew this a year later when it came out during the Watergate, and helped end my trial, actually. But at that time, we didn't know it. None of them knew that they were in the crowd, prepared to incapacitate me totally. But it suddenly occurred to me, since you had just been blocked from putting this material into the Senate congressional record, that maybe there was a chance we could get it in the House congressional record. So I called over an aide to Conyers in the House and spoke to him and said, here's an idea, maybe you can do this. He went over and talked to his boss, Ron Dellums, and then from my area here in the Bay Area, and then talked to you. And you may not remember this, but you saw me in the crowd and you held up your hand like this. And you said, it's okay, it's going to happen. So when Kiriako was talking about putting it in an envelope, here's what happened. The aide that night told me later, this is 500 pages of top secret documents. So he is copied them. I think he copied them as you had done on a machine, and put them in the hopper for the, just put it in the hopper to be put in the congressional record for the next day, because Dellums had said, I ask unanimous consent to extend my remarks. I'll give you some documents. And that's what he did. So he's sitting there wondering what is going to happen now if anybody takes a good look at these documents. He gets a call from the government printing officer, whoever it is, puts out the congressional record, and he's afraid they're going to say the jig is up. But the question was, gee, we've never had somebody put in 500 pages before. Would you mind if we extend it over 2 days? So they did extend it over 2 days, and there in the House congressional record is 500 pages of top secret and secret documents, which the Senate had just decided they couldn't do entirely. So it's exactly like John popping this envelope into the mail and getting it through. coming back now to, and then they passed what became known as the Dellums rule, that you couldn't put in more than 10 or 20 pages without somebody looking at it and getting more approval than they had before. And as far as I know, that's gone on. So we changed the procedure there. Now, Julian would be not only threatened with isolation if he were kicked out of Ecuador, if he's extradited to this country. Before there's a trial or anything else, I am virtually certain that he would be not only put in prison immediately with no bail, but in isolation from the beginning. And he would stay there for the rest of his life. Chelsea Manning had this experience from Kuwait on when she came back, then Bradley, when she came back and was put in prison at Quantico, my old base, where I went to officer candidate school and basic school when I was in the Marines. She's in isolation in a jail right there for 10.5 months. And the only way she got out of that was public pressure and senators, whatnot. Nobody could get in to see her, including representatives who tried to see her. No journalists from the time she was arrested in Kuwait until 7.5 years later. She was commuted The sentence was commuted by Obama, and she got out at the end of Obama's term. No reporter had ever been able to talk to her. No interview. However, for 7.5 years, Ed Snowden took counsel from that experience and knew that if he was going to interact with newsmen, as he did do, and is still doing, about the meaning of the documents he was giving them and how to interpret them and what the acronyms meant, and many things that had to be explained about the things, he had to be out of the country. The same would be, now Julian would be in isolation for the same reason as Snowden, and that is they were working at stuff that was much higher than the top secret crap that Gravel experienced when he was in the Army. And a lot of the Pentagon Papers are very boring and very nothing, really. 7,000 pages of that stuff. Has a lot of stuff that didn't have to be put out. I put it out so that I wouldn't be accused of having censored the material myself or having redacted it. So I put it all out, even though it wasn't all that interesting. Now, Chelsea and Ed Snowden had information which they gave to Julian Assange, I should say, which Chelsea gave to Julian Assange, which was much higher than top secret. Communications intelligence material, again, you were probably dealing with that to some extent, Mike, when you were a control officer. But this was communications intelligence and intercepts and so forth. They would claim, at least, to worry that each of them had many more secrets that they could tell, especially Snowden. And Snowden, I think, would be in prison for the rest of his life in isolation, so that he couldn't tell people in the general prison population his secrets that he still had to put out, and they could communicate them one way or another. That would be their excuse for giving maximum punishment and setting the strongest possible example to anybody else who might want to follow their heroic example. So isolation would be their fate, I think, essentially for the rest of their lives. And that is regarded, of course, as total torture. Anything, I was just reading the other day, beyond 15 days is regarded by Amnesty International and many psychologists and others as torture, cruel and inhumane treatment. And that's what they would be suffering. My friend Mordecai Vanunu, who revealed the Israeli nuclear program in Israel, including their probable H-bomb arsenal, was in isolation, as I recall, for 11.5 years. Not 10.5 months, but 11.5 years out of what I think was a total 17-year sentence. And it wasn't real good for his mental balance while he was in the isolation. He recovered a lot when he got in the general prison population. So that's what Julian is facing. I've been saying for years now, it's been years, that Julian has been, in effect, incarcerated one way or another, that he was absolutely right in believing, in my opinion, that he would be extradited and that he would suffer this fate after a trial which would not be a fair trial. It's not possible for a whistleblower to be indicted under the Espionage Act, as they all have been, essentially, and get a fair trial because he or she cannot argue to the jury that why they did what they did, or what public interest was served, whether there was have testimony from experts as to whether there was any damage, or whether there was any benefit to the intention, and would be regarded as irrelevant, as it was in my own case. I was the first person prosecuted on these grounds for a leak, top secret leak back in 1971 to 73. And when I got on the stand for 4.5 days, my lawyer asked me, why did you copy the Pentagon Papers? And I had saved a lot of details so that I could give them under oath at that time. I was not allowed to answer that question. Prosecutor said, objection, irrelevant. And the judge held it up, accepted that. My lawyer tried different ways of getting the question through, Leonard Boudin, and finally said, Your Honor, I have never heard of a case when the defendant was not allowed to tell the jury why he did what he did. And the judge said, Well, you're hearing one now. And that was the extent. Now, my trial ended under extraordinary circumstances, unprecedented and almost unparalleled since. It's kind of a miracle that I got off, since my judge had been offered his life's ambition, if that trial came out all right and quickly enough, namely to replace J. Edgar Hoover, who had just died, as the head of the FBI. And he dismissed that as a grounds for ending the trial when it came out, when it was leaked out. He said it hadn't affected him at all, that offer. But eventually, having found that I'd been criminally overheard, wireless wiretapping, and his effort to kill me and so forth, incapacitate me totally, various things led to my not going to prison. But even I would probably have been allowed to be in the general prison population because for my 115-year sentence, if I'd gotten it, because the material I put out was only top secret. And Chelsea's material, rather than not, what she put out was secret or less, that's much lower category, or unclassified. What Snowden put out was higher than top secret. And Assange put out stuff, they would just put him in isolation, I think, just to punish him for his years of irreverence toward the intelligence establishment and the classification system. Now, as I've said, no possibility of a fair trial, assurance that he would be extradited. As I said, I've been predicting that for years, and other people said, oh no, he's just staying there because he doesn't want to spend a few months in jail in England for having jumped his bail and gone to the Ecuadorian ministry. And many respectable journalists and others less respectable, but many have said that's the only reason he's staying in. It's just to protect himself from a few months in jail. Now, I felt I had come to know Julian Assange well enough to know that was not true. That he, in fact, when he told me that he was absolutely prepared to go to jail in Britain for a matter of months or even a year or two, I forget what the maximum he would have faced for that. His only concern was life in prison or in the US. I was sure that was true. And let me say something about it, about Julian, that not everybody is in a position to say, having not met him, or would say, frankly, even if they had met him. Because Julian is a very unpopular person. He's gotten, I would say, an extremely bad press, including from the New York Times, from the very first moment that they printed his material. They treated him the way they treated me, but that's another story. As I told him, I got pretty much the same treatment from the New York Times. They don't like sources very much. My guess is that they think of sources to them the way police think of their snitchers, namely necessary, important for their careers and justice process, but basically bad people who've betrayed their promise to keep secrets, and they're opposing U.S. policy, and they're not patriotic. Anyway, that's the way, frankly, I was treated. But Assange was a little shocked that he was treated that way, but he was, as was Chelsea, exactly the same way. More important than that, though, was that he subsequently got very bad press from people. In years when I said he absolutely did not deserve it, I'm prepared to say that his activities in the last couple of years, 2016 and so forth, are rightly controversial. And I by no means agree with his judgment on all the things that he chose. I cut somebody a lot of slack who's been in one, psychologically and in terms of judgment, who's been in one room or one little suite of office for 6 years. I don't know. I think that would affect my mental and emotional balance very significantly, or anybody else's. And I don't judge him very much for his judgments in the last few years, frankly, though I can disagree, and I do disagree, with a number of those judgments. But having said that, I don't say that to separate myself from my unconditional support for his need for the asylum, which he deserves in other places, and he has in Ecuador. My unreserved condemnation of Ecuador for washing their hands of someone to whom they've offered asylum, rightly so, and for their political purposes. And I'm going to go one step further. As I said, a lot of people who've seen movies about him, which I think in every case were extremely unfair to him and biased. And I say that in the following, pardon me, I say that in the following context, that a lot of people who have met Julian, he's not their cup of tea, and he doesn't like them. And I'm not sure I would like to work for him, as a matter of fact, from what I've heard about his autocratic behavior and toward subordinates in general. I wasn't his subordinate. I met him for several days in England when he was, and I was helping him put out the Iraq war logs, which I helped him do at a press conference. And elsewhere, I spent several days with him there. I visited him in his Ecuadorian asylum twice now. And as I say, many people, first of all, you don't have to like Julian Assange or even approve of what he's done in terms of judgment in the last few years or ever, in order to be totally supportive of his asylum and opposed to his being tried on Espionage Act charges, which would be of extreme ominous significance for the press in this country and everywhere else. So basically wiping out the First Amendment to a very large extent in terms of freedom of the press. He would be the example of a publisher and a journalist, they would use it for that, who was actually indicted and convicted, and it would cool a lot of journalism other than handouts and official channels for authorized leaks. There would be some people who would risk jail, like James Risen and others. I think people that I dealt with, like Neil Sheehan and others, Hedrick Smith, would have risked prison in the face of the possibility of prosecution. But a lot of them won't. As Mike said of Congress, ordinarily cowardly affects every profession, journalism, politics, and everything else. So a successful prosecution and conviction of Julian would be a tremendous cooling effect on any reporting of national security. But I say the unusual context I want to put this in is this. I don't know how many people I've heard say this. Having met Julian, knowing his circumstances, and the courage that he showed at various points earlier in doing what he should have done. I liked Julian Assange when I met him first. I liked him on the visits that I made with him. There are many people, as I say, there's an enormous number of people who have not met him or seen him only on movies who do not like him. There are many people who hate him. I am not in either of those camps. I am someone who liked Julian Assange, respected him, admired him. I could even say when I saw what he was going through in that embassy year after year, I loved him. I not only sympathized with his plight, but I felt, I feel love for this person. And I admire him. So I have a personal aspect on this. And again, without feeling I have to endorse and don't endorse everything that he's done, as a matter of being best judgment or anything else, I feel absolutely committed to keeping him out of an isolation cell.
Could I raise something that's a different segue? And that is that what we're doing, we have to be realistic and realize that we're not going to influence the government. That's the sad nature of it. And so if he's not, the chances of saving Julian before this thing plays out are difficult. What I'm wondering is, could we not incite riots in Britain that would then move towards the embassy? Are there not enough peace groups out there and journalists in Britain that I don't have any contacts with journalists there, but if they could turn around and get a brown vest or a red vest and put it on as a group and go to the embassy and screw it up. Just get up thousands of people around the embassy. That might suggest a possibility of sneaking him out. And that's what I've always felt, that the answer to this is if we could get a billionaire who could put forth the money to get helicopters and do this, we could probably get him to safety. But absent that, I'm very pessimistic about how this is going to be handled by Trump, the Trump government. So that's just my 2 cents. I always take the positive, and let's fight, but not just talk. Let's just fight and see. I don't know. See if there's an element in Britain that might want to step up to the plate and do something in that regard. Just a thought.
It will be possible. And Mike, there aren't too many. You're the former senator who would come up with that idea and be speaking from somebody who was willing to take risks like that and did take the risk. And I appreciate it. And by the way, it's very pertinent. It does remind me of something, frankly, that I've scarcely ever mentioned. People in London knew about it, who were then supporting him. But on my first visit, I think it was there, he had just been refused. We arrived to do visits, and we were told a new consul, or whatever the person in charge of that embassy was had arrived, not sympathetic to Julian, and was forbidding anyone to come in to see him, which was certainly his right under the asylum rules, and that we couldn't get in to see him. And so I had decided that, and I said it on the phone, which may have been very helpful to some of the people we were working on. I said, I'm going to go tomorrow morning, and I'm going to sit in front of that doorway at the embassy, and nobody's going to get in except over my body until they'll have to arrest me. I had some experience with the power of civil disobedience, and I thought that'll give them some. Well, we got there, and by God, the rule had just changed. And of course, we took it for granted that I hadn't had this in mind when I said it over the phone, but I didn't have any doubt that had been noted, as a matter of fact. And so you're right, though. I think actions like that would be absolutely appropriate. Find creative ways to bring the attention of the people. As I said earlier, the idea that there was a secret indictment was being dismissed as paranoia and grandstanding by Julian and his lawyers for a long time. I was sure that was not the case. Well, now we know it isn't. They made a mistake, and they admitted that they have indicted him. So that has vindicated that thing, which has gone on for years now. Is did he have a basic need to stand on his asylum rights and stay in that place? Well, one last thing, my wife just came down to call me. I'd promised her I would get out at this time, but I think I have to put that off. And to make the following point, they have said, Ecuador has admitted, the British have assured them that they will not send him to a place where he faces a death penalty. Notice, I did not face a death penalty. Chelsea Manning did, essentially. And Ed Snowden, they might or might not choose to do that. But that's in this country. It depends on the charges they raise. Well, the US is, of course, a place where he would potentially face the death penalty. So the question in my mind is, Ecuador is saying now, we've been assured that that's not an issue. They haven't come right out and say, that I know of, that means that he can be sent to the United States. A way around that could be, we have been assured that we won't seek the death penalty on these charges. But that's pretty, and that they might take as reason enough. Okay, in theory, we don't extradite somebody to a place that can face the death penalty, but in this case, he's been assured he won't get those charges. In the case of Chelsea Manning, her charge list definitely included a possible death penalty. But the prosecutor said, we won't go that far. We will not ask for the death penalty. But it was very clear the judge, and he didn't have a jury, she didn't have a jury, the judge would make the decision on sentencing the end, and the judge could have decided to give the death penalty. The prosecutors would not bind the judge's hand on that. So there's a lot of murkiness here. I want to repeat, there's no question in my mind that he should not be sent to the United States here for 10 different reasons, but one of which is that he could not possibly get a fair trial. We don't have an Official Secrets Act as Britain does, and whether that's fair or not, if he'd violated British law, if he had done this in Britain rather, it would be fairly clear that he had violated the Official Secrets Act. The same would have been true for me. But in our country, we don't have an Official Secrets Act. Why not? We had a revolution. We didn't pass the Official Secrets Act that British did. We have a First Amendment, which very few other countries do have, and Britain does not have, as a matter of fact. So we don't have an act that is regarded as constitutional under which he can be tried. He should not be tried here. And I would say, let me make this, I've said the very dramatic, just in terms of media today, the amazing statement, I like Julian Assange, even if I don't like everything he's done and all this, but I like him. I'll make another dramatic statement here. Well, I'll leave it at that. He should not be sent back. It would not be fair to do so. He deserves strong support. And as Mike Gravel just said, that definitely includes the possibility of acts, non-violent acts of protest and obstruction. If these wrongs are waged against him, that is very much in line with what should happen.
May I interject as the next senior person after Mike and Dan? May I say something?
I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
you're
Dan,
really a junior here, I believe.
what you remember, what you're talking about, the death penalty and all, brings back a flashback when our Supreme lawyer, Eric Holder, after Ed Snowden ended up in Moscow, he wrote an official memorandum under Justice Department stationery saying to his opposite number, the head prosecutor in Russia, look, please give Ed back. We promise not to torture him, and we promise not to kill him. And I'm saying, my God, Eric Holder said that in this official memo to the Justice Department of Russia. So, yeah. And so here you go. It's the same sort of thing. Now, I think solitary confinement for the rest of your life is worse than death. But I'm against the death penalty, of course. I too would add that I love Julian. He's my friend. Okay, I'm a good friend, and I don't have a problem with anything that he's done. And I think that you're quite right, Dan, in saying that if the only time you see Julian is when he's standing up, facing into the man, facing into the people who are persecuting him, well, he comes across as a little arrogant. Well, hell, he should be arrogant given what he's. So it's a bum rap in my view. He's a very warm person, one-on-one. And the first time we saw him in the embassy in Ecuador, we were celebrating the Sam Adams Award for that year. Man, we had just a wonderful time. He had only been there 2 years. Now it's going into 7, I think. So I give him some arrogance. If it appears like arrogance, I give him every benefit of the doubt. When I was with him 3 days before the election in November of 2016, he was spent. He had done all he could to make sure that enough information that he was privy to got out into the open with the help of people like you and John Pilger. He did this, and the notion that he would be brought back here where he has no business being here and subjected to the Espionage Act. It's just too much.
Boy, if I could say, I just remembered, I agree with you, Ray, totally, with everything you said there. It occurred to me what I was about to say, the other dramatic thought I would say. which slipped my mind as a senior moment since I'm 87, much older than you, Ray, and almost as old as Mike Gravel. It was this: I would be just as strong. This is going to be hard to believe, but it's true. I would be just as strong against the extradition in the same circumstances of Stephen Bannon or anybody else I could name, a journalist, or I would be as strong against the stopping of publication of Breitbart News, which is totally a purveyor of vicious, racist, terrible, inflammatory stuff under the Espionage Act, let's say, as for Mike Gravel or Tom Drake or Jesselyn Radick or any of the other people who have faced that issue. It's not a question of politics. And I really do trust myself that I would be as strong to oppose that abuse of the Espionage Act against these people with whom I totally disagree their politics as I am with Julian Assange.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
If Steve Bannon wants to hold me to that, I don't want to shake his hand, but I will support him in a fight like that.
I would too.
Dan, if you have to go, I really appreciate you spending the time with us here. This fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good.
So, Mike, I have a question that a reader sent in, and I want to put it to you. A reader from Berlin says, question for Senator Mike Gravel from Berlin. And how many U.S. senators, the ordinarily cowardly ones, how many U.S. senators actually support Julian Assange? How can one galvanize an international interparliamentary support for Assange now that are really willing to organize the growing list of German and EU parliamentarians currently involved and actively engaged to get protection and safe passage for Julian to a safe country? How do you appeal to U.S. senators in the current climate? I'm waiting for your answer, Mike. I know it's going to be good.
I don't hold any possibility that you'll get the Congress to weigh in on this. There are a lot of sadist people over there in the Republican Party, and so no. The answer is not going to come. Any tactic to help Julian, I doubt. Other than what we're doing here with the group, I doubt that there's any support out there in that regard. I think he's been trashed by the media. And so that's why I would look abroad. And if there are sufficient number of people in France, in Germany, that would travel to London and put some kind of distinguishing mark on them, that they believe in a free press, and that they know right now there's no such a thing as a free press in the United States. It's a corporate press we have, and we have to own up to that. And so I would hope that if there are people in Germany, and right now there's a lot going on over there, and if they could just deflect it a little bit, and it's a lot easier to travel to London than it is to travel to London from California, to travel from Europe. And so I would hope that there would be some people who have contacts over there approach those contacts, because Assange is not an American problem. It's a global problem. And when you look at what's happening to the media worldwide, it's appalling. And so since he's over there in their venue, and that they ought to get up on their hind legs, and probably some Americans would go over and help out. But I think that we need protests around the embassy, and who knows what that can happen as a result of this instigation.
Well, the person who sent the question just wrote, "Thank you for asking my question. We're organizing such trips to London," this person says. So
wow.
They're doing what you just
said. Great. If you can afford that, if you can do that, bless you, because that will be catchy over there. If you're any kind of a presence, at my age, if I were a little younger, I'd have my butt over there in a heartbeat. But I physically can't do that.
Well,
but I would encourage other people to get out there and disobey the law. The law is bad. you got to fight it. You can't lay supine. And that's the sadness of legislative bodies. I'm in the process of writing a book. The title of it says it all. Human Governance, the Failure of Representative Government. And that's what we have globally, because that's all we have. We don't have any democracies in the world today. We have representative government, and they're corrupted by the elites. Well, I could go on, but I won't. When you can get I'll get the book circulated to our group here when I've got it completed. But it's going to be a little radical.
From you, a little radical.
Well, what would you expect?
Well, let's hope that they.
No, this effort to do. I can't think of anything else. Maybe somebody else can think of something. But getting people to show up at the embassy, one, will intimidate the Ecuadorian officials, and two, it could intimidate the British government, because and you could probably get a member of parliament to speak up. You could probably get Jeremy Corbyn to speak up if somebody could approach him and he spoke up on this. Because if he were to become the prime minister, I'm sure that problem is going to be solved. So let's try to use him before the fact, because we're under such stress in that time frame right now. So if Corbyn came out and gave this substance, I got to tell you, you can get people to go to the streets and they'd have some legs.
I think that would be an excellent idea, but let's hope the ones coming from Europe do it before Brexit, because they may need a visa then that could be denied. So they've got to move on this.
Crazy.
Brexit's not going anywhere.
I was thinking, I proposed an email to Ray and Susie that we see a traditional march and rally at Trafalgar Square. I lived in London in the early 80s. I remember going on many of those, and remember seeing Tony Benn, the late Tony Benn, speaking at these, some really great left-wing figures that still the Labour Party had in those days, and they happened regularly. And I don't see why you can't get 500 people in London to march there, and not to the embassy or to Harrods in that area, but to Trafalgar Square. That's just an idea thrown out there. I'm glad you raised that, Mike, because that's one of the things we hope to talk about tonight, some ideas about how to raise protest and actions. John, do you have anything to say on that?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
Yes, please.
Actually, I feel frustrated the last couple of weeks, seeing all the news coming from London, reading news reports of this new Ecuadorian ambassador on his way to London with instructions of some sort. We don't really know what these instructions are. I'm worried. I'm nervous. And it's up to us really to keep the pressure on, because I'm not sure anybody else has the wherewithal or the ability or even the desire. And so let's keep doing these things. Count me in. Let's all work hard to get the word out. I hope we can get word to Julian that we're here, we're doing this, we care about him, we care about what he stands for. And I think the fight has just begun, Joe.
Yeah. Well, WikiLeaks has tweeted out our stream here, so they're watching it, and hopefully they'll pass on to Julian if they can through his lawyers.
But I hope
some of what we've spoken about tonight. I want to, before I call Ray, and I just wanted to say one thing that I was told by WikiLeaks through Susie, when I referenced before a so-called meeting with reporters in a conference call, they said it never took place. This is what I understand their message to be, because I'm a little curious. I was curious about that. I hadn't heard about it. That there was no group talking to the no group of reporters speaking to Julian. So Ray, sorry, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm simply going to invoke something you're familiar with. It's called the Noah principle. Mike may not have heard about this. It's the Noah principle is this: no more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arcs. We're going to build some arcs here. The rain is flowing. With this new ambassador going there from Ecuador into the UK, they're going to try something, I think, over the Christmas holidays when everybody is distracted, everybody's shopping at Harrods, and they'll just try to get them out of there. And so when I say no more awards for predicting rain, well, we'll get the rain. We got plenty of that. And we have to stop grousing about the rain. We've got to figure out what to do. Now, one of the ideas I had, and I'm very much with you, Mike, in terms of talking about action. I've visited Julian 4 or 5 times, and he's right sort of catty corner from Harrods. Now, Harrods, Harrods, that's where the hoi aristoi do their Christmas shopping. And wouldn't it be terrible to inconvenience them by having a watch going around Harrods on behalf of Julian with posters and give out handouts and so forth? Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to do? I think it would. Joe added the notion of banging pots and pans, which has a nice revolutionary tradition in and of itself. Last thing I'll say is that there has been a vigil. The Catholic worker in London and from Dublin, Kieran O'Reilly, and his group have been vigiling 24/7 in front of the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, can't we find more than 17 people? I mean, hello. Sure we can. All we need to do is kind of say, all right, this is what we're going to do. We may be only 2 times 17 first weekend, but Harrods is a good place to show our mettle, and it may not be the best place. Trafalgar Square may be better. The U.S. Embassy may be still better. But are we not imaginative enough? I mean, bright as we are.
I'm with you on Harrods. With you on Harrods. Make people uncomfortable, and that brings attention. So no, I would forget Trafalgar Square, forget other venues. It's Harrods, it's the Ecuadorian embassy, and if that slops over into the inconvenience of people shopping, more power to it. That's what's going to bring attention to this in Britain, and this battle can be won in Britain. We can't win it in the United States. So it's got to be a fight in Britain, and we got to bring Germans in and French people in and Belgians. And so enough said. If Ireland is doing this much, then they're putting to shame the Germans and the French and the Belgians. And so, and of course, you got some people in Spain that would get involved. We just have to encourage somebody that, and here again, I want to stress, if you could get one member of parliament to make a speech on this subject, it doesn't have to be Corbyn. Corbyn could come along later when he would feel that this is okay. But if we could get one, and I thought I saw somebody put a note up on here that that making that recommendation. Just get a speech in parliament. Then you got an individual that can stand up, and that can cause other individuals to stand up. And when a lot of people out there in the populace, when they recognize that there are some leaders, they're going to step out. They're going to step out. We have to get 100,000 people around Harrods and around the embassy, and of course that will include Harrods. Period. So that's what.
Well, it's not the first time we disagree, right? 36 members of European Parliament have signed an open letter in support of Julian Assange from the Netherlands, Spain, Greece, and Germany. And we have Diane. I think we're going to bring her in pretty soon. She could talk more about this. So there's some action in European parliaments. And as Mike pointed out, don't expect anything from Capitol Hill here in the United States. But we've got European parliamentarians, but none in the UK, funny enough, that I know of. Maybe there's been a couple. But Corbyn, it's curious why he doesn't bring up Assange and make that an issue and make it a big issue. But it's happening right there where he's living, right there in the capital. So
he could do it. He could do it.
Of course he could. But he probably is calculated with his advisors that politically he's trying to become prime minister and keep his position as Labour Party leader, which he's been able to hold on to despite the insurgency against him in his own party. Maybe he's calculated that would not be helpful to him. And you, Mike, you as a senator, as a former politician, you know what that's all about.
Yeah, so, I sure do.
Having to be elected first before he can do anything perverts a lot of people. Is Diane available? I think she's trying desperately to get in, but it hasn't happened yet.
write a letter to Corbyn, and we'll all sign it. That could have some effect on him. And circulate it. If we had other names in the Parliament, a speech or two would not hurt us at all. And so if you take the initiative and just put all our names on there and get this over to Corbyn and tell him that we admire him and hope he's the next PM, and would you weigh in on this, because this issue is so vital to free speech in the world.
It's happening on your doorstep, and that's the next Vips memo, Ray. What do you think? That sounds pretty good.
Sounds like a good idea. And we'll put your name on it for sure, Mike.
Well, I'm going to hold you to that until I pass. In fact, even after I'm gone, you can keep using it.
Sounds like something out of Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls there. We'll have to go right up there.
I'll leave a legacy. I'll write a legacy letter to you authorizing you to use my name for as long as you want.
Well, it gives a certain gravitas to our listeners.
Well, I noticed that the older I get, the more attention I get, and I'm slowly burying all my enemies. So there's some benefits to old age. And
I'm beginning to enjoy them.
but I'm very serious. If you could get a letter to go to Corbyn and use all of our names, I think he would read it. It might have an impact, and and the issue is freedom of the press, freedom to speak out worldwide. And Britain is supposed to be one of the world leaders. Acted.
Also habeas corpus, I mean,
yeah.
Hello, 800 years since the Magna Carta.
So I hope you can put that together. I've read some of your letters, and you're great. You're great.
Well, I'll try, Mike. Thanks.
I just want you to use my name on your letters. I want some of the credit slipping over to me.
Well, we'll put your letterhead on there, Mike.
Well, I do use the letterhead with the American seal. That's the only perk I have. On my business card, it's got a nice, beautiful gold seal, and it says U.S. Senator, and it gives the dates of my office, and I hand that out, and it works like magic. It works like magic. So if you wanted me to send you if you got the names, and we'll send it under my stationery, which is Senate stationery. I get it through the Senate office.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, one small detail, Mike, not relevant here, but I think everyone needs to know the prestigious committee that you were, or the prestigious subcommittee that you were chair of when you took advantage of your prestigious position as head of that subcommittee to get one of its members and then read the Pentagon Papers. So what committee?
That committee was the least prestige committee in the Public Works. And there was buildings and grounds. A rake and go out and rake in front of the Capitol. I would be doing my duty. But we didn't have, one of the things that's not generally known, that the young attorneys that were advising me when I couldn't do it on the floor, they said, well, there's a precedent that permits you to use your committee. And I said, what's the precedent? The House Un-American Activities Committee. That was the precedent that permitted us to get away with what we did. Who knows? Go ahead.
You might also mention how it was you were able to stand for hours and hours without having to go off to the men's room.
Well, I had a colostomy bag put on me, and so did Alan Cranston, because he was going to be in a chair. And then I had an enema down at I had to talk it over with the doctor down in the Senate, and so we had this all physically figured out. And my chief of staff, his job was to come up and had a little bleed valve down by my ankle, and his job was to go ahead and bleed it. And I didn't have it. It had to be chief of staff. We weren't messing around.
That wasn't in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Doesn't he filibuster in that movie? But that part was. Let me bring in Caitlin Johnston. Very happy to see you here. I don't know how much of our discussion tonight that you've heard, but you can weigh in on anything you want at this point.
Oh, no, I don't want to weigh in. The heavy hitters have gathered, haven't they? So
They hit. The heavy
I'm
hitters
feeling
have hit
very
already.
intimidated. Yeah, no, it's been wonderfully interesting. Yeah, but I love the talk about, like, the civil action. I think that's so important right now. We really need to start making noises. That we can't just let it slide by. There's so few of us. And we need to make noises, and we need to make it cool. Like, it needs to be cool. So yeah, I'm really glad that we're talking about actions, and social media is so important right now. You can get a message out there really quickly, get on Twitter and, make it funny, make up the memes and stuff like that. Liquid chalk, that's what I've discovered recently. Did you know about these things called liquid chalk pens?
No, never heard
These
of it.
are, right. Well, there was actually a massive dispute here between the AMBOs, we call them, the ambulance drivers, and the paramedics here and the state government. And they were using these liquid chalk pens to write all over the ambulances their grievances about, things. And it was hugely successful. They certainly got their message out there, and people were very sympathetic towards it. So you can use these pens, just on your car, to just put the hashtag, free Julian, free Assange, and just get people thinking about it. Especially, like, I implore my fellow Australians right now, this is the time to do it, and start writing to your representatives in Parliament. We've got a very interesting situation here. There's no seat is safe. They're counting all their votes and stuff, and so it's time to start making some real noises at people who can actually enact change. And in Australia, we're in this privileged position. He is our boy. He's our man. We can bring him home. There's nothing to say that we can't. He has not been charged, as far as we know. I mean, we do know that there are these secret indictments, but that's secret indictments are virtually no indictments, are they? Like, unless they put it out on the table, right. We can bring him home. So, and there's no reason we can't. So I think Australians especially are in an interesting position right now where we can do this if we want to.
Tell us about the Australian politicians and how they've reacted or not reacted towards Julian Assange, and what should they be doing?
Well, they've been sadly very silent. About the only one that I can think of off the top of my head who has actually said anything is the redheaded Pauline Hanson, who has the reputation here, I guess, of a female Trump. Like, she does not have a highly regarded reputation. Her politics are pretty crazy, pretty right-wing, but she supports Assange. But she's the only one who's actually said anything.
Any voice is good. Any voice is good.
Any voice is good. This is true. Yes, any voice is good. But it's been really hard to see. I support the Greens here, and they've been very backwards in coming forwards about the whole Assange thing. There's the silence. We really are the basement gimp of the American establishment, and we just go along with whatever. We've signed on just in this last month or so to all these ridiculously Orwellian advances in surveillance and so on, just to please our oligarchical overlords, I guess.
You're aware that we've sent over Marines to protect Australia. I think it's a battalion, less than a battalion. And so you ought to be ashamed that we have to send Marines over there to protect Australia.
You've sent quite a few people over here. It's true. Like, right through the highest levels of government. So, there's definitely protection, and there is coercion, and but there's really no reason other than pure fear that we don't stand up and say, oh, enough of this. We're our own sovereign nation, and this is our guy, and he hasn't done anything wrong, and this is ridiculous. Just bring him home.
And they've been quiet, you said, but have any of them, like some American politicians and others, get called for his imprisonment? They want him here, or even assassination. Some people have called for here in the U.S., or they just ignore him completely. They just ignore him.
No, there's these kind of weasel words. I don't know if you were aware, there was a big story here in the papers and on TV. Pamela Anderson came on our version of 60 Minutes and made an impassioned plea on behalf of Julian Assange to our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, ScoMo we call him, to do something about this. And his response was sleazy. It was lewd and crass and, very degrading. So there was actually, and I was really happy to see this, an outcry against the way that he had responded to that. And you could tell also that there was generally a very positive sort of feeling towards Julian Assange coming home. It's not something that they poll on, because, who's going to poll on it? If you poll on it, you have to do something about it. But in general, I live out in the suburbs. So I talk to, regular Australians all the time. Most people don't think he should be in there, and that it's time, whatever he's done, they're a bit confused about what he might have done. But like whatever he's done, it's time that, to bring him home. It's been long enough. And so, you hear that in the lawn bowls clubs, you hear that just, in at the playground during school pickup, that sort of thing. The general consensus to me anyway, and it's very hard to tell, is that that there is a feeling that, this has gone on too long, and whatever's going on, it's all a bit shady, and it's time to bring him home, to bring our boy home.
Caitlin, let me ask you about a friend of mine, Australian, Andrew Wilkie.
Yes, wonderful.
He was a wonderful analyst in ONA, the Office of National Assessments, and he spoke out before the war in Iraq, saying the intelligence was bogus. Okay. Now, if memory serves, he's now one of the Green MPs. Is that correct? Is he still an MP?
He's an MP. He's an independent, but a very popular one. Yeah. So, no, that's true. There is support there. That's true. So, he's been a marvelous, an outspoken and person to have in Parliament as well. So, I do like to talk us down, but because it can be, it can be frustrating. But
might he be persuaded to speak out and stir up some support for Julian? He knows. He's a good guy, and he spoke out once before. And why didn't he do it again?
Right, you're right. Yeah, no, that's certainly a door that could be pushed open there. You're right, Ray.
Thank you.
But yeah, so.
We're still waiting for Diana to come in from Europe, so we're going to stay on Australia for a little bit longer.
Okay.
You've written quite a lot about Julian, haven't you?
Yes, I write when I can about Julian Assange because, it seems to me that it's a nexus point. He represents a nexus point where the will of the people and our right to know, our right for information, to know where our tax money is going and to what we're actually doing in overseas wars meets, it's where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? And he, by just publishing these documents, he brings truth to what has been, just an ongoing propaganda narrative for as long as we can. They've just developed this way of keeping everyone in line through storytelling, and that's very interesting to me. Like the fact that whoever gets to tell the narrative gets to run the world. And I think that's why they find Julian Assange so challenging, because he does challenge that narrative. It's simply a story, but it's a very powerful story that keeps people paying their taxes and keeps them going into the voting box and ticking their little boxes and believing that they live in some sort of benevolent state that would never do such things. But he keeps, bringing truth into that equation and bringing doubt into the to our minds about what's actually going on and waking us up. It wakes people up when they're like, well, if you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? Maybe I should pay more attention. And yeah, when you rule through narrative, you don't really want people paying attention. It's like telling a lullaby.
I think, Caitlin, that's one reason why a lot of people don't like you either.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I've certainly had my own, dissenters, but but that's okay. We've all got to do our jobs in our own ways, I guess. But yeah, and I'm sure that's why they don't like you, Ray, much too, as well. So
we're all very popular here. Let me bring in Diane.
Yeah, you too, Joe.
Let me bring Diane in. Could you just tell the audience where you are and something about who you are, and then what you could report to us about the European Parliament?
Hi, can you hear me? See
Yes.
me? Sorry, it's like 4:30 in the morning. I've got a little bit too much audio here.
You were fine before. Yeah. Oh, the
can
audio.
you hear me now?
Yeah, there's a little feedback, but
I can turn this off.
That's good. That's clear enough.
Hello, good evening. Hi, everyone. Yeah, well, it's very late. I'm just trying to make sure that this is good. I don't understand. My computer is actually not good on all these things, but
Joe, I think you're muted.
yes, I think you're back.
hello?
Yes. So
You're
tell us
back.
what's going on. Where are you? Where are you?
Hello?
It's 4 o'clock in the morning, but so you're
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
6 hours, 7 hours ahead of us? Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
Ahead.
great. Hi. Well, I'm from Berlin, and we've been supporting Julian and WikiLeaks for a very long time, and started with Chelsea Manning, and we've been trying to galvanize parliamentary support in Europe, starting with Germany, across party lines. And I must say am I disconnected?
No, you're fine. Carry
Great,
on.
thank you.
Carry on.
And these have been parliamentarians that have supported Chelsea Manning and whistleblowers throughout the years. And I'm glad that we've had the support, because Germany, of course, didn't have any whistleblower protections and didn't afford Edward Snowden asylum or the chance to speak before the inquiry that was called in after the NSA revelations that he made. And he would have been the crown witness, if you will. And it was all under Merkel's watch and her coalition government that is now, as you see, we have a changing of the guard since she had to step down from being party head of the conservative Christian Democrats. That being said, it's polarizing to see what's happening in Europe and the turn to populist illiberal politics. And therefore, a lot of parliamentarians are seeing that we need to support a free press, transparency, and access to documents, for example, that WikiLeaks has published, and are very keen on supporting them. The thing is just right now, everything is just so demonized, and we've got actors like The Guardian right now that are working with, if you will, intelligence agencies and in their stenography to demonize WikiLeaks and poisoning the public perception of the value of WikiLeaks and the grave human rights situation that Julian is in right now in terms of refoulement, refugee status, asylum. These all used to be holy sacraments, if you will, of what used to be the rule of law, which is deteriorating greatly. So they're very keen on maintaining this. That's why my question earlier to the senator, is it possible that we have no US senators that understand this, that we are enchaining ourselves, as we see in the UK right now, from international covenants and the rule of law, that no one is willing to speak up on his behalf? I mean, I'm sure that we can galvanize interparliamentary support around the world, not just Germany and Europe, that are willing to engage and support this. And I will agree with the senator that this is not just a US problem, it's a worldwide problem. But it would help if we did have some spine coming from elected officials and senators in the US that say, I may not agree with all of his opinions, but this would be the most challenging case since the Pentagon Papers, if you will, the free press, and why the US press, like the New York Times, constantly refuses to fact check and continues to smear Julian with sexual allegation charges and so forth. He was never charged and so forth. Even if the journalists themselves, when they're writing these stories, didn't include that in their stories, but their editors happen to just put that in to generally just poison the general perception of Julian Assange's plight right now. So I've given up on hoping that the journalistic craft and the press are going to do their job of holding those in power to account. I think we have to deal with maybe our elected officials that aren't so beholden to US interests. For example, here in Europe, that are willing to travel to London, for example, and willing to hold vigils in London, that are willing to go on a regular basis to London. But the Ecuadorian government has ignored them. And this has been reported in Der Spiegel and by other journalists, like Michael Sontheimer, for example, how many requests had been made earlier this year. Up until now, the Ecuadorians have just answered and said, oh, yes, you can, according to the new protocols, visit Julian. This has not transpired yet. It may transpire in the next coming weeks, we hope. And many are willing to visit. But of course, the new protocols only see for maybe 2 or 3 or 1 at a time. That's why it's important just to set a precedent and just keep that momentum going. I would encourage anyone who's watching the stream to write their parliamentarians to submit a solicitation or, to visit Julian and to go. This is the most important political pressure that we can apply right now, as well as artists and prominent figures, but they're not really standing up in line to go and engage in a vigil. So therefore, we have to apply political pressure. That would be my position from Berlin.
Great. And there's I think that there's great hope with what you've said. Again, I'm just embarrassed to say that the U.S. Congress is going to step up to this issue. They're too busy on other areas, and they're mesmerized by Trump. But since we saw the protests in France, I don't know why there can't be any protests in Britain. You see, Britain fancies itself as the one of the leaders of the world. Well, this leader has got to step up and protect free speech in the world. And that's what this issue is freedom of the press, free speech. And so if we could get some members of the German parliament, the Bundestag, to make a few speeches, that would be very valuable. This is very catchy. Once you get going, You don't know what will cause something to go viral, but you've got to have hope, because things go viral all the time. And if we could keep pushing from various directions, one of these could go viral and really capture the enthusiasm of the younger generation. And they'll like to protest. If they can get out of school or in between school periods, just to go protest, because they're angry. They know the world is falling apart with climate, what's happening in the climate, and the irresponsibility of the political leaders who are just into getting themselves reelected. I have no faith in representative government, none at all. And I say that with great pessimism, but I've observed it up close at the highest level. And all I can say is, in a crude fact, it sucks. So if you could get anybody to speak up in any of the parliaments in Europe and at the EU, it would make a difference. It would make a difference. This stuff is catchy when people realize that their basic freedom is at stake with Julian Assange. They turn around and get rid of Julian. We've lost a major tool to get people aware of it. And when you look at the media, it's corporate media. Hell, they're not going to do anything to change the dynamics of our system of self-government, but the people could. And so that's why we just got to keep touching these nerve endings. And one of them may strike, it may not strike, but that, in my experience, is where it's at. If we could get somebody from the German parliament, get somebody from French, get somebody from the British, get somebody from Belgium, Denmark, almost any place. And then if you got somebody at the EU that would speak also, because that would entice them to speak. That's the only counsel I can give in my dotage.
Well, Diana, there were 36 parliamentarians already who have spoken out. Could you tell us a little bit more about who some of these parliamentarians are, and what exactly did they say? Was it a joint communique, or they're separate? I think the Bundestag put out a separate thing a couple of days ago. Could you tell us a little more details about it?
This was an attempt to try to galvanize, if you will, support across country and party lines. It has been, if you will, essentially a left and Green Party or progressives in these different parliaments in different countries. And we're trying to reach out because there are, if you will, libertarians and others that see the deterioration of free speech and what this would mean in terms of, if you will, European citizens. And this should concern Britain, if you will, like the foreign bar of extraditing people that will perhaps be under, that was Theresa May. That was maybe the most honorable thing that she's ever penned. For example, in the Lori Love case, a British citizen who would probably have not survived a US prison system because the conditions are just inhumane, especially with people with extreme autism or Asperger's, or that couldn't survive solitary confinement, for example, as John Kiriakou so acutely described previously. It's just so disconcerting to see how The Guardian, for example, has just defaced themselves in penning this completely false story with, you know, ridiculously sourced news about the Manafort, you know, meeting with Assange and so forth, and has not taken the story down, has not retracted it, which is now part of the Dianne Feinstein, Pompeo investigation on something that has nothing to do. I mean, the sealed indictment, if we will, I don't know. I'd like to hear Ray McGovern's opinion on this. Is mostly due to investigation prior to the 2016 election, and perhaps were spurred on after the Vault 7 publications.
But Diane, can I interrupt you for a second and ask
Yes,
you,
please.
how did the German media, did they cover this at all? Did I suspect TASS wrote something in Berlin, but not the...
Yes, they
the Belgian-
did, but
well,
it seems to be like this general malaise in the press that they don't like to malign their colleagues. I've seen many more other articles published around the world, and less in Germany, if you will, on that. Even the Washington Post, if you will, even questioned the veracity of that story. I've not seen too much here.
I meant on the 36 parliamentarians. I mean, you say maligning colleagues. Julian is their
No,
colleague.
I meant in the press, not so much parliamentarians.
Did they reported on it though? So the German people know about this.
Yes, they do, and the parliamentarians know about it. They've been spearheading this initiative. I think there will be more. This is going to be like an open letter that will continue to grow. As long as these parliamentarians realize it's just not a left initiative or a green initiative, and they feel that they can also sign on to this. And this is going to be happening. And this, as I was trying to ask the senator, this happens to be a thing in Europe. This interparliamentary support network. I don't know how that works with the U.S. and how much they could convene with their U.S. colleagues, if you will, to galvanize support for this. I just cannot believe that. I mean, I remember during the Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning, formerly, that there was support in the U.S. and they could connect with U.S. senators that were concerned about Bradley Manning's well-being. I just can't believe that there isn't a single elected official in the U.S. that doesn't see the risks that are at stake here for First Amendment.
You haven't been in the U.S. for a while, I think.
I've been living here for 30 years. No, forgive me,
Yeah,
but
there you
I'm
go.
European-based.
Yeah. What about Sarah Wagenknecht? Was she part of that?
Yes, they also signed on. Yes,
Yeah,
and we expect to have others, but we will publish the other names once we have convened and after they have gone to London. And I have just heard that the Ecuadorians are very keen because they were embarrassed or concerned about their public image because they had denied and had lied. Stefania Marizzi from Italy had reported on this, and I believe that WikiLeaks had also published this, that the Ecuadorians had denied that the German parliamentarians had sought to visit Julian, and now they're actually saying, oh, please do come and visit him. So of course this is a critical juncture right now, the holiday season, and everyone of course is going to be distracted with their families and the holidays and so forth, but they're still willing to go and visit him, willing to take part in vigils, speak out, and do whatever they can to make sure that this is not lost from the public view right now. And they will continue to visit in the new year, and they will continue to submit visitation requests.
These are all Germans, or it's a mix of other countries?
I don't think I should comment on that right now, but at this point we're talking about German parliamentarians.
Okay. Und jetzt we're going to Ann Garrison out in the West Coast in the Bay Area. Ann, I don't know how much you've heard of the program tonight, but weigh in. We can't hear you. There you go.
Okay. Oh, it says I have to unmute. Let me see.
You're fine. You're unmuted now. We could hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I'm glad I've been listening to this because it gave me several ideas. One is that I will attempt to contact Rosa Esteras. She is a Spanish member of the European Parliament, and she managed to get a resolution through, she and others managed to get a resolution through the European Parliament calling for the release of an African political prisoner, Victoire Gabriel Mahosa, in Rwanda, who was finally released after 8 years, having been sentenced to 15. And I can contact her and ask her about the feasibility of introducing a similar resolution regarding Julian Assange. Also here, I've been thinking about how to expand awareness outside, political intellectual circles. And Steve Seltzer, who does a labor show on KPFA radio, a weekly labor show, was one of several people who took a resolution to the Labor Council in San Francisco, which actually has quite a bit of political weight in that town. And they couldn't get it passed. And, I don't think there was a lot of understanding. It takes, and I've been thinking, it takes kind of an extra intellectual step. Like, it's very, very easy to see what was wrong with apartheid. It's very, very easy to see what's wrong. Well, for most of us who might care about Julian Assange, it's very easy to see what's wrong with the way that migrants are being treated at the US-Mexican border. It's relatively easy to see that what's happening in Yemen and US involvement in that is horrific. It's less easy to see that there are now 5.5 million displaced persons in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's 1 million more just this year. It was 4.5 million at the end of 2017, and it's now 5.5 million. But unlike apartheid, which is easy to understand, you have to understand things like proxy war and resource war to understand what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Likewise, understanding Julian Assange requires a little more, it requires one more intellectual step. And so question is, how can we explain this to people outside our intellectual circles who have spent a lot of time studying his situation and or reading WikiLeaks? I didn't understand how important this was myself until I started reading a lot of WikiLeaks. Tomorrow we're having an event in San Francisco at sort of a political action center. And we had one of these in Berkeley where we had a full house. This is a slightly larger venue in San Francisco. And my guess is we'll have a full house there too. Hopefully we'll be able to stream it. And one of the things we want to talk about, Janice Bernstein will be part of this, the event tomorrow evening in San Francisco. One of the things we want to talk about is, what do we do? Where do we gather if and when he's removed from the embassy? And I agree with those who said that it's likely to happen before Christmas. And I have suggested that there be an international action list, at least of where people are going to gather, wherever in the world, once he's taken out of the embassy. And then if there are further steps towards his extradition or his actual extradition. And another group I have made some effort to get together is the Berkeley Unitarian Universalist Church. They host a lot of social justice forums. And so I'm going to suggest a panel there. And there are a lot of people, a lot of political intellectuals and social activists across this country who belong to Unitarian Universalist Church, wherever they are. So that's another place where I think educational forums could be organized. I've also been asking myself, who knows about this? What do they know? And I'm in the habit of risking seeming rude by asking people on buses, in taxi cabs, in international hostels, or wherever, do you know who Julian Assange is? Or some other question that I'm curious about, how much you know, how widely known is this? And I was recently in an international hostel in Portland, had several of them actually, and there were a lot of Australian young people there, probably between 20 and 30. And I asked one group, what do you think of Julian Assange? What do you know about him? And the response was, oh, he's in Ecuador, right?
Yeah, they know something, but not much.
Yeah.
And we're really about to end our program. We have only 2 minutes left. I wanted to just bring up the issue before I say goodbye to everybody about extradition, because this is a legal battle that could be fought. And maybe I shouldn't introduce this with 2 minutes left, but that's something to keep in mind, and we could talk about next week. I want to try to bring in Francis Boyle as an international lawyer who is pretty, who knows a lot about the extradition because of IRA members that the Irish government wanted back from, or the Northern Irish government wanted from the U.S. So he could fight there, he says, in the European Court of Justice. His lawyers, Julian's lawyers, could fight. That might be a point where there's a whole nother obstacle to getting him to the U.S., the extradition. It may not be as easy as the Americans think or as people think if he's taken out to go to try to fight the extradition battle. But with that, I'm going to sign off for tonight. I want to thank Diana in Berlin, former U.S. Senator Mike Gravel in Monterey, California, Anne, who's, I guess, in Berkeley. And I want to thank John Kiriakou from the Washington area, who was on with us earlier. Sean O'Brien from the Yale Privacy Lab. I don't know where he was calling from, maybe from New Haven. And I hope I'm not forgetting. Ray McGovern, of course, from here in Northern Virginia, where I am. And I think I've spoken about everyone who joined us tonight. And most importantly, I forgot Dan Ellsberg, also from Berkeley, who was on for a good time. And it was fascinating to hear Mike and Dan go over the aspects of the Pentagon Papers story again, like a bunch of old friends. And it was great for all of us to be able to listen in to that conversation. So with that, I say goodbye to everyone. 3 hours went pretty quickly. And we'll see you all again next Friday for the 9th edition of the Julian Assange.
Friday or Sunday?
23 hours.
Friday.
Next Friday, Mike. You're welcome back anytime.
Okay. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Never figure out how to